Welcome to the Piracy Iceberg. Today we'll cover topics all about the high seas, ranging from well-known entries like Blackbeard to the Frenchman that ate his victims alive. Get comfy and explore the Piracy Iceberg with me. So before we get into each entry, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of some piracy terms, so these terms will make a lot more sense later on. This also includes two entries at the top of the iceberg, so I'm gonna lump these together now. When people talk about pirates, you would often hear the words pirate, privateer, corsair, and buccaneer used more or less interchangeably, but this is wrong. And there is a difference. A pirate is a very broad term. It just refers to any misbehavior or crime happening at sea. This includes coastal raids, intercepting ships, murder, plundering treasure, everything illegal happening at sea and on a boat. You're a pirate. A privateer was a pirate with papers. They were private individuals, essentially mercenaries, hired by governments to rob merchant ships, pillaging settlements and taking over ships belonging to a rival country with their own armed ships. As you can tell, there might be confusion here since some privateers could be piratical, sometimes attacking ships that weren't targeted, or sometimes actual pirates could be hired by governments without them being legally considered privateers. So the line between a pirateer and a pirate is often very blurry. A corsair was a term specific to the Mediterranean, referring mostly to Muslim pirates aligned with the Ottoman Empire between the 14th to 19th century. They were privateers, but corsairs specifically refer to these Ottoman-sponsored privateers aiming to disrupt the Christian states of Europe maritime commerce. In some contexts, corsair can also mean a privateer or a pirate working under the French crown. Finally, a buccaneer is a term specifically referring to the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. The word buccaneer derives from boucanier, French settlers who hunted and smoked lots of wild animals in the Caribbean. They smoked these animals over something called a boucan, essentially a wooden frame, hence boucanier. Buccaneer. They were hunters before turning to piracy and mainly raided Spanish merchant ships leaving for Europe. Or in other words, a pirate does naughty stuff at sea. A privateer is a hired person who does naughty stuff at sea. A corsair is mostly an Ottoman who does naughty stuff at sea, and a buccaneer is most commonly a Frenchman who does naughty stuff at sea in the Caribbean. This should give you an idea of the different terms. With that out of the way, let's finally dive in. Blackbeard. Edward Teach or Thatch, or more widely known as Blackbeard, was one of history's most infamous pirates, if not the stereotypical pirate in media today. Little is known about his early life, but he was probably born in Bristol, England in 1680 and very likely went by a pseudonym. We're gonna see this more often in the iceberg, but pirates loved using pseudonyms as to not tarnish their family name or to keep themselves hidden from authorities, so it is likely Edward Teach was a pseudonym and his real name will probably never be known. In 1716, he joined the crew of Captain Benjamin Hornigold, who became a renowned pirate during this time. Remember him, he becomes important in later entries as well. Hornigold gifted Teach a sloop and set out for the American East Coast, where he was first mentioned as commanding a crew of around 70 men. Teach's crew grew to a flotilla of 3 ships, and in November 1717, his crew took over a French slave ship named La Concorde and captured it after a short battle. They probably recruited some of these slaves on board and left the rest on a small island in the Caribbean. He renamed La Concorde to Queen Anne's Revenge, and this would become his flagship in the following months. The ship had around 40 large guns and became notorious for ransacking and plundering multiple ships in the Caribbean. He and his crew held another crew captive and then sunk a sloop off the coast of Crab Island, where the captain described Teach as, quote, a tall spare man with a very black beard, which he wore very long. This was the first account of Teach's appearance. Later descriptions of Teach likely embellished this key detail of his, as the scholar Charles Johnson writes in his General History of the Pirates, sometimes the only source we have on renowned pirates, and we're gonna meet this guy a few times throughout the iceberg. So our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard from that large quantity of hair, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there a long time. His beard was black, which he suffered to grow of an extravagant length. As to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons and small tails and then turn them about his ears. He is also said to have strapped 3 pairs of pistols around his chest along with cutlasses and knives around his waist. Though there are no reports of him actually murdering those he held captive, he likely kept his appearance as to strike fear into his opponents. and hoping they would just surrender to him instead of putting up a fight, which is a much more lucrative outcome for a pirate. By early 1718, Teach was at the height of his power, and in May, he and his crew blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, ransacking any ships that would leave port. Over the next 5 or 6 days, 9 ships were plundered of their goods, and in one instance, he held a crew captive and ordered a ransom of expensive medicine, probably drugs, otherwise executing the crew if the requirements were not met. The government supplied the drugs, and the crew was let go. In June 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge and another ship ran aground a sandbar in North Carolina and were damaged beyond repair, thus Teach had to abandon his flagship. Later that year, Alexander Spotswood, governor of Virginia, ordered a bounty on Teach's head, wanting him dead or alive. Royal Navy First Lieutenant Robert Maynard, on board the HMS Pearl, located Teach on Ocracoke Island. A bloody battle commenced, with Teach and Maynard fighting in hand-to-hand combat with their cutlasses, with Teach dying with 20 cutlass and 5 pistol wounds. Teach's head was promptly hung from the bowsprit, the very tip of the ship, of the sloop Jane. Many legends were spread after his death, partly due to embellishments like Charles Johnson earlier. It is said his skull was lined in silver and used as a cup, or he buried his treasure after his death. These legends will likely stay legends, and many believe this treasure never existed in the first place. However, in the 1990s, Queen Anne's Revenge was found off the coast of North Carolina, with many artifacts being recovered, including navigational devices, cannons, and a sword hilt. Blackbeard is probably the most famous pirate in existence and has spurred a ton of media over the centuries. Rightly so, he's a legendary figure in pirate history. Davy Jones. Davy Jones is one of many nautical superstitions and is a personification of the spirit of the sea, usually malevolent. A phrase you often hear is Davy Jones's locker, being a metaphor for the oceanic abyss, the resting place one would be sent to after drowning or sinking along with a ship. The true origin of this phrase is not known, but there is a dozen or so proposed origins, too many to mention here shortly, but many have attributed this to the biblical figure of Jonah or local folklore, though the first printed mention was in 1726 in the 4 years' voyages of Captain George Roberts. Quote, "But now they had no goods at all," he believed, having disposed of them all, either by giving them to other prizes or heaving the rest into Davy Jones's locker, i.e. the sea. So no one truly knows where this phrase came from, but it has influenced a lot of media over the centuries, like in the Pirates of the Caribbean film series. Somali pirates. Some may think piracy is a thing of the past, but piracy is still a very real thing to this day. As long as there is a ship and a crew, there is bound to be piracy involved. Somalian pirates are widely considered the most notable example of modern piracy, beginning in the early 90s, after the fall of the Somalian government, plunging the region into a brutal civil war which is sadly still ongoing, with the federal government being rendered essentially useless and the navy disbanding in 1990. Foreign fishing trawlers entered Somalian waters and began illegally dumping waste and overfishing the area. Local fishermen tried to defend themselves and began to band together and arm themselves, employing tactics like taking over foreign ships until the owner paid a ransom. It is important to note that Somalia lies in a critical geographic region, the Gulf of Aden, where more than 20% of global trade flows through. So you can probably see why this would be profitable for the locals, especially considering Somalia is a mostly agricultural country and the economy has been basically destroyed due to the civil war. In 2005, a tanker, MV Feisty Gas, and yes, that is its real name, was hijacked and ransomed for $315,000 US. I just had to include that. In 2010, the estimated costs due to piracy rose to $238 million US. A year later, a report suggested that the indirect costs of piracy, which includes insurance, naval support, legal proceedings, rerouting of slower ships, and other costs, was estimated to be around 6.6 to 6.9 billion US. Piracy reached its peak between 2008 and 2011, but a lot of anti-piracy measures have been taken over the years and has been steadily declining since 2012, although piracy activity has been getting a rebound since 2024. Out of the 4,185 soldiers whose ships were attacked by the pirates and 1,090 hostages in 2010, a third were sadly abused, many of them being used as human shields for pirate attacks or tortured. 62 people have died in a 4-year earlier period, many due to suicide, malnutrition, and 25 due to murder, though it is important to mention the vast majority of pirates never hurt any captives and simply demand ransom. While pirate activity has waned over the years, some occasional incidents still occur. In the end, Somali piracy was less about glory, but more about survival and desperation, spawned from the unstable and lawless situation the locals lived in for years. Jolly Roger. The Jolly Roger refers to probably the most iconic symbol of piracy, that being a skull and crossbones on a black background. The origin of the name Jolly Roger is kind of unsolved. The name Roger does not refer to the actual name Roger, but likely was a euphemism for the devil, or sometimes called Old Roger. The term could also have derived from French Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, referring to the blood-red flags pirates used to fly, signaling no quarter. No quarter meant the ship's cargo or valuables would be taken by force and no mercy for life would be spared in the attack. Pirates would first fly a friendly flag or an allied nation's flag, giving their target a false sense of security before hoisting the black flag, signaling quarter given, ordering the ship to surrender, and the crew's lives would be spared. If they did not heed this warning, they would hoist the red flag. To signal yes, the victim ship would have to take their own flag down, known as striking their flag. There are some variations to the Jolly Roger. Some had a skeleton, or a dagger, and a heart, which largely depended on the specific pirate crew. In any case, the Jolly Roger has become the defining symbol of piracy, even being the symbol of online piracy. Golden Age of Piracy. The Golden Age of Piracy spanned for around 80 years between 1650 and 1730, when piracy reached its peak across the Atlantic, Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and the coasts of Africa. Historians usually divide the period into three sub-eras: the buccaneering era, lasting from 1650 to 1680, characterized by French and English pirates in Tortuga, Martinique, and Jamaica, plundering Spanish merchant ships in the Caribbean and parts of the Pacific; the pirate round, lasting from the 1690s to early 1710s, when pirates traveled long distances to rob the British East India Company in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea; and finally the post-Spanish succession period, lasting from 1715 to 1726, sometimes early 1730s. This is the period most people refer to when talking about pirates, characterized by thousands of privateers left unemployed after the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, who then turned to piracy in the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, West Africa, and the east coast of America. It is far too hard to condense 80 years of history in a single entry, but in short, the period saw trade routes booming, colonies expanding, and thereby maritime travel and piracy expanding as well. Sea Peoples. If you're on this side of YouTube, you probably heard about this group of people. The Sea Peoples were a collection of tribes hypothesized to have attacked the eastern Mediterranean and especially Egypt around 1200 BCE during the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Late Bronze Age collapse is a huge can of worms in itself, but can be boiled down to a huge societal collapse where most states lasting centuries somewhat suddenly and violently disintegrated, notably the Hittites and the Greeks, who entered the Greek Dark Ages for around 4 centuries afterwards. The only states that continued to exist afterward were the Egyptians and the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, though both much weaker than previously. Now that's cool and all, but what does that have to do with pirates? Well, Egyptian hieroglyphs, especially those of Pharaoh Ramses III or Meneptah, show Egyptians fighting against large armies of seaborne raiders, arriving via large flotillas from foreign lands. These sea peoples appear pretty abruptly in ancient history, as they are not mentioned after Ramses III's reign. Not much is known about these sea peoples, though many speculate they might have been an ancient form of pirates. They might have been a broad coalition of migrants who sought new lands, as they likely have suffered from the same societal decline. The Sea Peoples were probably comprised of tribes living around the Mediterranean, like the Shurden, Washesh, Lucca, Karkia, the Peliset, later becoming the Philistines, who settled in Canaan and became the main rivals of the Israelites, as seen in the Old Testament, and the Denyen. Some scholars believe the Denyen can be attributed to the tribe of Dan of the 12 tribes of Israel, as they are believed to be a seafaring people, as said in the Song of Deborah. In any case, these groups of people likely were skilled seafarers and could be considered the earliest form of pirates we know of. Oak Island. Oak Island is a small forested island off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, famous for being the site of one of the longest running treasure hunts in history. No one's really sure where the original myth comes from, but it is likely spread via word of mouth before being first published in print in 1863. A dying sailor from Captain Kidd's crew buried 2 million British pounds on Oak Island. We'll discuss Captain Kidd in detail later on as well. In 1795, Daniel McGuinness discovered a strange circular depression in the ground beneath as he was looking for a suitable location for his farm. Since he had heard of the story, he and his friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, kept digging and reportedly found a layer of flagstones, and then every 10 feet, or 3 meters, they found oak logs as markers. The ground was noticeably more loose than the surrounding soil, and the men found tool marks or pick scrapes along the walls of the shaft, known as the money pit. They gave up after digging 30 feet or 9.1 meters down. In 1802, the Onslow Company continued excavation in the pit, digging it to around 90 feet or 27 meters deep, and found layers of charcoal, putty, coconut fiber, and a mysterious stone slab inscribed with symbols. This stone slab remained unciphered and changed hands over the years. A local inn landlord commented, "Men who don't believe in Kidd's treasure say that it isn't an inscription at all. It's only some accidental scratches." One researcher claims the symbols read 40 feet below, 2 million pounds lie buried. You should take this translation with a huge grain of salt though, since the researcher says he got this information from a quote-unquote school teacher long since dead. In any case, they continued digging, but struck some sort of water tunnel, flooding the entire pit. To drain the water, the Truro Company decided to dig another tunnel, 109 feet or 33 meters deep, northwest of the original shaft, but this new shaft too was flooded, and the company thought an underwater tunnel was connected to the sea, as the water level sank and rose with the tides. In a nearby cove, they found the water tunnel system and dug a final tunnel in an effort to shut off this water system, but they failed once again, as this tunnel was filled with water as well, along with the money pit falling in on itself. It is speculated the treasure, if it even exists, fell through the third tunnel into a deep void, never to be seen again. There are far too many excavations done over the centuries to fully cover each and every one of them, so I'll cut it short here. Essentially, the treasure has not been found to this day, and it is very unlikely it ever will. But is this story true? Maybe. There may be other explanations for this weirdly shaped pit. Some scholars have proposed a sinkhole might have formed there. The ground would naturally be softer there, and the pit filled up with natural debris, like trees falling and blown into the pit, which would explain the oak logs. Another theory proposes the pit might have been a Masonic initiation rite, involving a hidden vault. Stephen Sora speculated the pit was dug by the Knights Templar and hides the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail. A strange place to hide it in my opinion though. Yet another theory purports that Francis Bacon is the actual author of the Shakespearean works, and Bacon made Oak Island for him and his followers a hiding spot to hide ancient manuscripts and important texts. Scholars claim to have found hidden symbolism alluding to the secret treasure in Shakespeare's texts on rock formations on Oak Island itself, and claims that the stone slab found in the pit contained a cipher Bacon allegedly used. According to marine biologist Barry Fell, the symbol on the stone resembled the Coptic alphabet, an ancient language spoken in Egypt. It allegedly translates to, quote, "To escape contagion of plague and winter hardships, he is to pray for an end or mitigation thereof. The people will perish in misery if they forget the Lord, alas." As you can tell, there are dozens of explanations, theories, and things alike about Oak Island, and I am barely scratching the surface. Let me know if you want a full-on deep dive on Oak Island in the comments below. Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny, or Anne Bonn in some sources, was one of a few recorded instances of a female pirate. Yes, surprisingly, piracy was not exclusively a male activity. In all of recorded history, only about 100 women went on to be pirates at sea, though many, including Anne Bonny, had to disguise as men, so the actual number may be much higher. There's basically no information about her early life, no primary sources, no records of baptisms, nothing. The only source we have on her early life is from the aforementioned scholar Charles Johnson, which should be taken with a grain of salt, since this information may be embellished or plain wrong. We don't know when she was born, but her birth might date to around the year 1700 near Cork, Ireland. Early on, she and her parents moved to the province of Carolina in America. Her father, perhaps William Cormac, who was originally an attorney, was quite successful as a merchant and allegedly bought a plantation, though there are no records of this. Her mother died when she was grown up, and Anne Bonny married a poor sailor, which outraged her father, who then kicked her out. Anne Bonny and this sailor, whose existence is more than dubious, moved to Nassau on New Providence Island. In August 1720, Bonny, Johnny Rackham, and another woman, Mary Read, along with 13 other male pirates, stole a privateer sloop and put it out to sea, attacking merchant ships in the West Indies for 61 days. On these raids, Bonny handed out gunpowder to the men manning the guns, known as being a powder monkey. On September 5, 1720, the governor of New Providence, Woodes Rogers, put out a proclamation demanding the arrest of the crew, specifically naming Anne Bonny and Mary Read, though under their pseudonyms. A victim of the pirates, Dorothy Thomas of Jamaica, described Bonny and Read as follows, quote, "They wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and each one of them had a machete and pistol in their hand, and they cursed and swore at the men to murder her." On the 22nd of October 1720, Rackham and his crew were discovered by Jonathan Barnett, a former privateer, who attacked the resisting crew, but the crew quickly surrendered. They were taken to Jamaica, where they were tried for piracy. Rackham was tried first and found guilty, executed on November 18. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were tried on November 28 and also were found guilty after a short but inevitable trial, sentenced to hanging. Both Annie and Read asked for mercy because they were pregnant, which was likely granted by the jury, although it is unlikely they both were. Mary Read died in prison of unknown causes in April 1721. Interestingly, we don't know how or when Anne Bonny died. She might have lived a few years in Jamaica before dying of unknown causes. Some purport she was rescued by her father and escaped back to Carolina, living out the remainder of her life, finally dying around the 1780s in Charleston, though this is speculative at best. Even though her career was very short-lived, she remains a legendary figure in pirate history, being one of a handful of female pirates in the golden age of piracy, spawning lots of media and popular culture, and even having a statue of Bonny and Read erected in London. Pirate speak. When people think of pirates, they stereotypically think of how they spoke, saying stuff like "Arr, matey," or "Avast me hearty," or "Shiver me timbers." Pirate speak today is mostly a product of later fiction rather than history. Pirate speak was likely much more complex than this, as pirates were not a homogeneous group of people, but were comprised of a dozen or so nationalities. English, Scottish, Irish, Dutch, and French, and many more were on board a ship. Much of the modern pirate voice comes from Robert Newton, the English actor who starred Long John Silver in Disney's 1950 adaptation of Treasure Island. Newton was born in West Country, England. He used his thick accent to create a powerful, more exaggerated version of a pirate, which practically became the standard for pirate speak today. Especially "arr" and "matey" may have been used in West Country during the 1700s, but there hasn't been a recorded instance of this lingo being used by seafarers, although Newton did like using these a lot. On the other hand, some phrases are accurate, like "aye," meaning yes, "avast," meaning stop, or "bilge rat," an insult referring to unwanted rats at the bottom of the ship. It is certain pirates cussed way more often than even normal seamen, who already were pretty known for cussing a lot and drank a lot more, so they may have sounded more rough and drunk than the average working class person of the time, which is portrayed somewhat accurately in media. Importantly, these men were mostly illiterate, so they often didn't leave behind any writings or primary sources we can use to accurately pinpoint how they spoke. Some phrases are entirely made up for literary purposes, mostly by aforementioned scholar Charles Johnson. In the end, pirate speak is highly embellished and sometimes completely made up to fit a narrative, as there are little to no sources recording pirates' way of speaking, leaving a lot to the imagination of authors and directors. La Buse. Olivier Levasseur, nicknamed La Buse, the Buzzard, or La Bouche, the Mouth, was a French pirate who was mostly known for his pirate activities in the Indian Ocean. Born in 1689 or 1690 in Calais, France. To a wealthy family, he first studied to become an architect before serving as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession. At the end of the war, instead of turning in his ship, he turned to piracy and joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew in 1716. He made a good name in Hornigold's crew and proved a great leader, even though he had a scar across one eye, limiting his sight. The crew split in 1717, and Levasseur attacked several ships off the coast of Brazil before turning to a West African slave port and reducing a local fort to ruins in 1720. Due to his quick, hawk-like strikes, he earned himself the nickname La Buse, the buzzard, a name for several species of prey birds. Levasseur became shipwrecked near Mozambique and set up a new base on the island of Sainte-Marie, near Madagascar. By this time, he became completely blind on his bad eye, needing to wear an eye patch. Levasseur and a small crew of a few men captured one of the largest treasures in pirate history, the capture of the Portuguese great galleon Virgem do Cabo, I think that's right, the Virgin of the Cape, which was full of treasures belonging to the Bishop of Goa, the Patriarch of the East Indies, and the Viceroy of Portuguese India, who all were returning home to Lisbon. The capture was bloodless, as the crew surrendered without a fight. The loot consisted of bars of gold and silver, dozens of boxes full of golden guineas, a coin minted in Britain during this time, diamonds, pearls, silk, art, and religious artifacts, stolen from the Se Cathedral in Goa, which includes the fiery cross of Goa, made of pure gold and inlaid with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. This cross was so heavy that 3 men had to carry it on board. In fact, the men didn't even bother plundering the victim crew at all. That's how much they'd stolen. It was probably worth millions, if not tens of millions today. The crew divvied up the treasure equally, and Levasseur went into hiding, settling down on the Seychelles. 9 years after the heist, he was captured in Madagascar and hanged in Reunion for piracy on July 7, 1730. Before he was about to be executed, legend has it he threw a piece of paper onto the watching crowd and shouted in French, "Find my treasure, the one who may understand it." This paper allegedly contained a cryptogram of 17 lines. This sparked a huge treasure hunt continuing to this day, even though it likely is entirely made up, and modern historians regard the legends as 20th century fiction. In the end, La Buse goes down in the history books as one of the most legendary pirates, stealing millions worth of gems, artifacts, and gold and silver, perhaps leaving behind some of this. Henry Avery. Okay, this is a bit of a crazy entry, so bear with me. Henry Avery, sometimes erroneously called John Avery, was an English pirate born on August 20th, 1659 near Plymouth, England. He was a renowned pirate operating in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and given the name the Ark Pirate or the Pirate King by his contemporaries, so you know this guy's a big deal. Avery was a sailor from his youth, serving on Royal Navy ships in the Caribbean, North Africa, as well as fighting in the 9 Years' War for the British. After the war, in 1691, he was discharged from the Royal Navy, but joined a privateering venture known as the Spanish Expedition, aiming to raid French ships in the Caribbean with the help of the Spanish to grow the stagnating English economy. But due to complications with papers, the expedition, consisting of a couple of ships, was stuck in Spain and held there for months. Many of the sailors during this time became outraged, as they were not paid for their stay, and many became desperate, fearing they might be sold as slaves to the Spanish. This sparked a mutiny where Avery persuaded sailors from the other ships to join his cause, and then took over the ship known as Charles II with 25 other men. They then unanimously elected Avery as their captain. Avery convinced the crew to set out for the Indian Ocean and promised that every man would get a share of the treasure, while he would receive 2. They then set out for the Cape of Good Hope, also renaming the ship to the Fancy. On the journey, the crew took over ships and convinced Danish and English privateers to join their cause, numbering around 100 men, stealing ivory and gold along the way. In 1695, Avery and his crew finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and rested on the Comoros Islands, restocking on provisions and plundering a French ship along the way, convincing around 40 men to join the crew. The Fancy now numbered a strength of around 150 men. In August 1695, the crew reached the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb near Yemen and joined forces with 5 other other captains, including Thomas Tew. Remember him, he will be mentioned later. Reaching a size of 6 ships and around 440 men, Avery was elected as captain to this large flotilla, and they waited for the Mughal ships to pass them. Side note, the great Mughal ships were filled to the brim with treasures and valuable goods. The Mughal Empire during this time was extremely rich, and many historians call the Mughal Empire one of a few proto-industrialized countries. This should give you an idea of how profitable raiding even just one of these ships was. A massive 25-ship large convoy was spotted near Surat, Gujarat, India. 2 escort ships were their main rivals, the 1100-man large, 80-cannon strong Ganj-e-Sawai and the larger 800-man large, 94-cannon strong Fateh Muhammad. Even though Avery was massively outnumbered, the pirates attacked the 2 ships and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, which reportedly lasted 2 to 3 hours, but the pirates came out on top. The Ganj-e-Sawai was probably the largest of the Mughals' fleet and had cargo valued anywhere between 100,000 to 875,000 pounds, including 500,000 gold and silver pieces, though keep in mind these numbers are hotly disputed. Assuming around 600,000 pounds were stolen, this would equal around $400 million today, marking it as one of the, if not the, most valuable raid ever done by pirates, though again, this is disputed. The Mughals were naturally outraged at this loss and closed English trading ports in India, making the English put a bounty on Avery's head, and this is marked the first global manhunt in history. However, in June 1696, Avery completely disappeared from the face of the earth, and the crew scattered across the globe, some moving to North American colonies, and some back to the British Isles, though Avery was never seen again, being one of the few cases of a pirate actually succeeding in his endeavors and retiring in peace with his riches. The plundering of the great Mughal fleet was extremely valuable for the crew, capturing the public imagination. Avery was immediately painted as this Robin Hood-like figure, capturing from the rich and giving to the poor sailors. William Kidd. William Kidd was born in Dundee or Greenock, Scotland in 1645 and moved to New York in his early life shortly after it was taken over by the British. Here he was a seaman's apprentice on a pirate ship before beginning his well-known privateer career. In 1689 he was a part of a French-English pirate crew sailing the Caribbean under Captain Jean Fanton. Under his command, he mutinied along with other members and took over the ship. The crew then elected him as captain of the ship, named Blessed William. Kidd is mostly known for his voyage to the Indian Ocean and his apprehending of ships which raided the East India Company, as he was ordered to do so by the governor of New England. He raised funds for this endeavor and got a new ship, called the Adventure, equipped with 34 cannons, oars, and 150 men. In September 1696, Kidd set course for the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa and made his way to the Indian Ocean. By February of the next year, he arrived at the Comoros Islands off East Africa. Since he hadn't encountered any pirates yet and his crew was cut by a third due to a cholera outbreak, he became desperate to cover his costs and fulfill his contract. It is here he decided to turn to piracy and actually killed one of his own crewmen after a dispute over attacking a Dutch ship, which Kidd decided against doing. Kidd and his crew flew the French flag and encountered the Quidach Merchant. In January 1698, this ship was loaded to the brim with valuable silks, satins, muslins, and gold as well as silver. When news of this capture got to England, it was considered a pirate by the government, and admirals were ordered to pursue and seize Kidd and his crew for notorious piracies they had committed. He renamed the Quidach Merchant to the Adventure Prize and set sail for Madagascar. Here he encountered a pirate, Robert Culliford. Reports conflict on how or why exactly this happened, but a large part of Kidd's crew joined up with Culliford and left Kidd behind with only 13 men. Since his ship was in a pretty bad shape, he scuttled it and went on board the Adventure Prize with his loyal crew. By this time, news had reached the crew that he was a wanted man now, a man classified by the English government as a pirate and to be apprehended immediately. Fearing his treasures would fall into English hands, he sold some of this to a man named William Burke, likely scuttled the Adventure Prize, buried some of the treasures on Gardiner's Island, and left for New York. The governor of New York ordered the arrest of him, which promptly happened on July 6, 1699. Kidd was put into solitary confinement, and he and his wife were separated, never seeing each other again. Kidd was sent off to England to be put on trial, and he was found guilty on May 8, 1701, of the murder of Moose, the crew member he had killed, and 5 counts of piracy. He was promptly hanged at Execution Dock. He Yep, a real place, in London on May 23, 1701. His treasure on Gardiner's Island was recovered, but many people still allege he buried treasure in other places, and searches were done, for example, on Staten Island and in Nova Scotia, Canada. In the end, Kidd remains as one of these legendary figures in pirate history, seizing large treasures after turning against the government and wanting to make a name for himself. Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet, known as the Gentleman's Pirate, is closely related to Blackbeard and Benjamin Hornigold from Tier 1. He was born in 1688 near Bridgetown on the island of Barbados. His family was pretty wealthy and he inherited his father's 400-acre large property after he died, along with the 94 slaves working on his plantation. This, along with his good education, earned him a place in Barbados high society. Bonnet married a woman named Mary Allenby on the 21st of November 1701 and had 3 sons and a daughter. He held the rank of major in the Barbados militia and may have fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, but details are hazy whether he had actually fought. In any case, in spring 1717, Bonnet abandoned his family and 3 surviving children to become a pirate on the high seas. Usually, pirates were of the working class or slaves, looking for a better life, not aristocracy, which rightfully earned his name as a one-of-a-kind specimen. We don't know why exactly he decided to do this, but some theories speculate it might have been his sexuality. He might have very likely been homosexual, although an unfulfilling marriage, financial issues, mental issues, or perhaps him hearing stories of pirates abroad and wanting to become one himself was the reason for his abandonment. Importantly, he had no experiences on the sea, but still decided to contract a loyal shipyard to build him a sloop, which was equipped with 10 guns and named the Revenge, not to be confused with Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. Bonnet recruited a crew of more than 70 men and paid them wages. Pretty unusual since pirates were paid via their share of plunder. Bonnet relied on his quartermaster and sailors for their experience, which left him not very well respected by his peers. He and his crew departed from Barbados and soon after captured and plundered 4 vessels near Chesapeake Bay off the coast of Virginia and went further north, capturing 2 more ships near New York City. In September 1717, he encountered, fought, and escaped a British warship while traveling to New Providence, which left the Revenge badly damaged, Bonnet seriously wounded, and half of the crew killed or wounded. In Nassau, he replaced his casualties and refitted the Revenge, upgrading the armament to 12 guns. Perhaps Bonnet is more known for his collaboration with Blackbeard, who he met while stationed in Nassau. They struck up an unlikely friendship, and Blackbeard took the Revenge and merged it with his flotilla, taking over command, while Bonnet was healing from his wounds. The Boston Newsletter of November 11, 1717, reported that Bonnet had been seen on Blackbeard's ship and commented, quote, "He has no command, he walks about in his morning gown," and then to his books, of which he had a good library aboard. Blackbeard and Bonnet plundered several ships off the American East Coast, including the French ship La Concorde, renamed to the Queen Anne's Revenge, as mentioned previously. Sometime after mid-December 1717, Blackbeard and Bonnet separated, but they soon encountered each other again near Belize. Here, Bonnet's crew deserted him and joined Blackbeard's crew. Bonnet had no choice but to oblige and joined Blackbeard once again. But this time, Bonnet was essentially a prisoner, confined to his quarters and having little to no say in command. Blackbeard put another man in command of the Revenge, and they sailed towards Charleston in South Carolina, famously blockading the port there. Blackbeard and Bonnet journeyed to Bath, back then the capital of North Carolina, and granted pardons under King George's Act of Grace, renouncing their piracy forever. Bonnet planned to go privateering against the Spanish, but soon found out his ships were sunk and looted by Blackbeard, his former colleague. Outraged by being betrayed, he resupplied the Revenge, renamed it to the Royal James, and himself adopting the alias Captain Thomas. He originally wanted to plot his revenge, but he missed Blackbeard on Ocracoke Island by a few hours. Bonnet returned back to his pirate ways and pillaged several more vessels. By August 1718, news had reached Charleston of a pirate vessel stationed in Cape Fear River. In late September, Colonel William Rhett led a naval expedition against Bonnet, and an hours-long battle occurred, leaving the pirates surrendering, while Bonnet escaped in custody. Bonnet was captured on November 6th, put on trial, found guilty, and hanged for piracy on December 10th. The death of Blackbeard and Bonnet marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of piracy for many, and Bonnet remains in history as a special case of an aristocrat becoming a pirate. Libertalia. Libertalia, sometimes also Libertatia, was a purported legendary pirate colony founded in the late 17th century in Madagascar, allegedly founded by pirates led by Captain Misson. Our only source of this is from the second volume of A General History of the Pirates by Charles Johnson, as mentioned in Tier 1. Side note, Charles Johnson is oftentimes the only source we have on specific pirate stories, and this is partly why scholars take accounts from him with caution, as they likely are embellished or outright false. Misson was a Frenchman born in Provence. During a stay in Rome, Misson was disgusted by the Pope and his inner circle, which led him to lose his faith and rethink his principles of life. He then took over the French warship Victoire and led them aboard a journey to Madagascar. On the way there, they allegedly captured 2 ships full of African slaves and freed them. It was reportedly a place of free society, a sort of utopia, with direct democracy, where the people as a whole held authority and made laws and rules. Additionally, all people lived in harmony, no matter their ethnicity, religion, sex, etc. Its motto was "For God and Liberty", and its flag was white, a stark contrast to the black Jolly Roger. Elevated forts are said to have guarded the port of Libertalia, while living quarters were made below the fort itself. Libertalia is very likely purely a work of fiction and not a real place, probably based on actual pirate settlements on Madagascar, which there are a handful of. Libertalia never shows up anywhere else other than Charles Johnson's accounts, and is probably just an embellishment of existing colonies. Woku. Woku, or Woko, translating to Japanese pirates, were pirates who raided the Chinese and Korean coastlines between the 13th and 16th centuries, first mentioned in the 4th century. This term was used after the Mongol invasions of Korea and China, as well as their attempts at conquering Japan. The people living in these areas suffered extreme poverty due to this, and thus resorted to piracy to make a living. The raids were particularly rampant throughout the later half 1300s and early 1400s, leaving many coastal villages pillaged and hundreds of pirates and soldiers dead. After the signing of the Treaty of Geihai, granting trading privileges, Woku activities calmed down in the Korean peninsula. However, Woku activity was not fully wiped out. In fact, it saw a resurgence in the 16th century, where the Ming dynasty enacted trade bans saying that quote-unquote unrestricted trade would lead to chaos, which reignited piratical activity in the area. The Ming dynasty also prohibited any seafaring as a whole, forcing merchants to establish themselves on offshore islands or overseas trading ports. The Ming navy was essentially non-existent and could not fight against the pirates. During this time, around 70% of Woku sailors were Chinese, not Japanese, and many Woku based themselves on the island of Taiwan and even entered the Philippines on the island of Luzon before they were expelled by the Spanish later on. By the end of the 17th century, the Japanese centralized and formed the Tokugawa shogunate, while the Chinese were ruled by the Qing dynasty. Most of the piracy disappeared altogether and eventually was wiped out. Roche Brasiliano. Roche Brasiliano, or Roque Brazilian, or some variation thereof, was a Dutch pirate. His name translates to Roque the Brazilian, but his real name was probably Gerrit Gerritson. Nothing is known of his early life, and not much information exists on him in general, other than he was born around 1630 in Groningen, the Netherlands, and moved to a settlement in Brazil at an early age, which was under Dutch rule at the time. The Portuguese captured the colony in the mid-1650s, and thus Brasiliano relocated to Port Royal, Jamaica, where he joined the local buccaneers as a sailor. He was reportedly a brave man and a good sailor, popular with his peers, and elected captain after leading a mutiny. Brasiliano cruised the waters around Mexico, picking off ships moving to Havana, Cuba, or Europe. Between the voyages, he would return to Port Royal to resupply, refit, and recruit new pirates, earning a reputation of a dangerous criminal. While researching this, I came across a claim that he was imprisoned in a Campeche dungeon. The governor of Campeche ordered to hang him. Brasiliano got a pen and paper and forged a letter, purporting that a group of buccaneers outside of Port Royal would pillage the city if they didn't release Brasiliano. Considering he and his crew were very feared and well known, the governor took that threat pretty seriously. I don't know how reliable this is, but if it did happen, he was indeed released. In any case, he purchased another ship from a man called Francois Loulonnet. Remember this guy? He will be covered in a later entry, and continued his piracy against the Spanish. He would often get drunk and threaten to shoot anyone who did not drink with him. He was also incredibly brutal with his victims, reportedly roasting Spanish prisoners alive on wooden spits or cutting off their limbs. He would often torture and execute captured Spaniards without reason, and allegedly made Spanish prisoners eat their own comrades. The Spaniards feared him so much, in fact, that mothers would use his name as a hushword for their children. As his Jolly Roger, he used an image of a skeleton with the text, "The corpse of a Spaniard," though these claims are pretty difficult to prove. After 1671, Brasiliano was never heard or seen from again. No one ever reported capturing or killing him, and he might have retired and lived the rest of his life secluded on an island, or lost at sea in a storm. Whatever became of him and his crew is lost to history. Spanish Main. I don't know why this is so low, but the Spanish Main refers to the Spanish holding that were in the mainland, bordering the Caribbean and its adjacent waters. This term is used to distinguish the smaller Spanish Caribbean islands known as the Spanish West Indies. This includes Spanish Florida, New Spain, as well as northern parts of South America. Sometimes the Spanish Main refers to a smaller part, mainly the area between Panama and Venezuela. This area was extremely wealthy, as lots of raw material was extracted from the Spanish colonies and shipped via the Spanish Main to mainland Spain in the form of gold, silver, gems, spices, hides, and much more. In hopes of profiting off of this enormous wealth, the Spanish Main became a hotspot for pirates, privateers, and buccaneers, as well as countries at war with Spain. And a lot of the pirate stories we covered this far raided these ships, though a lot of them were escorted via heavily armed galleons, protecting the riches. Thomas II, also known as the Rhode Island Pirate. Even though he's named this, we don't know whether he was actually born in Rhode Island. Evidence suggests his wealthy family was living there, but he might have been born in England around March 1649 before moving to Rhode Island. He married and had 2 daughters before moving to Bermuda in 1691. Here, the governor of Bermuda sent II a letter permitting him to attack French ships in West Africa, mainly in the Gambia. He set out along privateer Captain George Drew aboard a sloop called Amy. However, the two separated after being caught in a storm and suffered damage to their ships. II abandoned his plans here and turned to piracy, asking for the crew's support. Reportedly, they answered, quote, "A gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you." The pirates then elected a quartermaster and elected II as their captain, who renamed the Amy to the Amity. II reached the Red Sea in late 1693, where his crew spotted a large Indian ship with over 300 soldiers sailing to the Ottoman Empire. Even though they were severely outnumbered, the pirates attacked the ship and came out victorious after a short but bloodless skirmish. II's pirates stole the ship's treasure, worth around £100,000, equivalent to around 18 million British pounds today in gold and silver alone, not even accounting for ivory, spices, and gems and silk that were taken on board. It was evenly split up between the crew. Each received around £3,000, while II received 8,000, or about £1.6 million today. He wanted to chase down the other ships in the convoy, but he yielded due to the quartermaster's reluctance. They made their way to the Cape of Good Hope and reached Rhode Island, where II settled down for around a year. In November 1694, he went out for another pirate voyage, hoping to recreate the success he had. In August 1695, he merged forces with Henry Avery and attacked the Great Mughal Convoy, as mentioned in Avery's entry earlier. However, II was not as lucky as Avery. II was killed in a battle, reportedly disemboweled by a cannon shot, dying at the age of 46. Demoralized, his crew surrendered, though they were freed by Avery after the capture of the Fateh Muhammad. II's burial site is unknown, but some believe that II was one of the founders of Libertalia mentioned earlier and was buried there, though there is no evidence of him being buried in Madagascar, and his body has never been found. Samuel Bellamy. With many of these stories, we don't know much about Samuel Bellamy's early years. According to historians, he was born in 1689 in Devon, England, and joined the Royal Navy, and fought in several battles in his early teens. He might have had a wife and a child before moving to Wellfleet in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Here he met a woman named Goody Hallett, more known as Maria Hallett, even though that is not her real name, who he decided to have an affair with. In early 1716, he, with a group of men, including a friend named Palsgrave Williams, who funded the expedition, tried to find the treasures of a sunken 1715 Spanish treasure fleet which had wrecked due to a hurricane off the coast of East Florida. Back home, legends say Hallett gave birth to a son, which unfortunately choked to death early on. Hallett was blamed for the murder and imprisoned in old jail of Barnstable, Massachusetts, which is said to be haunted to this day. Side note, I might cover an iceberg about haunted places next. Let me know if you'd like to see that in the comments below. Hallett waited for Bellamy to return. Bellamy did not, however, have good success in finding the treasure, and he, along with Williams, joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew in the Caribbean, the same crew that Blackbeard was a part of at first. In June 1716, the crew revolted after wanting to attack an English ship, which Hornigold adamantly refused to do. While Hornigold and Blackbeard split up and did their own thing, Bellamy was elected captain and Williams quartermaster respectively. The 90-man crew captured a second ship named Sultana, and Williams was elected captain of said ship. Bellamy was reportedly well-mannered, tidy, and a very tall and strong man. He liked wearing black coats and wore 4 dueling pistols in his sash. During this time, he got the nickname Black Bellamy. In spring 1717, their greatest prize was coming. Bellamy spotted the Widder galley sailing through between Hispaniola and Cuba, a state-of-the-art ship carrying ivory, indigo, and lots of silver and gold. Chasing the slave ship for 3 days, the captain surrendered after being fired at by a single shot. Since the captain surrendered without putting up a fight, Bellamy put mercy on them and traded Sultana for the Widder. Here he held a pretty famous speech where he reportedly said, quote, "I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field, and this is my conscience tells me." This massive treasure has earned him the name Robin Hood of the Sea. With enough gold and silver to retire for life, Bellamy and his crew decided to sail back to Massachusetts. Bellamy in particular wanted to revisit Hallett again. As fate has it, a storm hit the area on April 26, 1717, and the Widder was swept up and driven onto the sandbar shoals of Cape Cod, where her masts snapped, and shortly after capsized and sank beneath the waves. Bellamy and everyone but 8 men of the 146-man crew died. 6 were hanged for piracy, so only 2 men lived to tell the tale between the Bellamy and the Widder. François L'Ollonais. I told you to remember him earlier, and you better have. This guy was an absolute madman, in the bad way. Jean-David Naud, known as François L'Ollonais, was a French buccaneer active in the Caribbean around the 1660s. L'Ollonais was born in France and worked as a servant between 1650 and 1660, living on the island of Martinique. After his servitude was completed, he wandered various islands before arriving and settling down in Saint-Domingue in Haiti, joining the local buccaneers. He received a ship by the governor of Tortuga, who was also a buccaneer. In 1663, he was shipwrecked near Campeche, Mexico. The crew survived the initial wreckage, but a party of Spanish soldiers attacked the crew, almost killing everyone. L'Ollonais survived by covering himself with the blood of his peers and hiding beneath the bodies of the dead. L'Ollonais escaped with some surviving slaves and canoed towards Tortuga. On his way there, angered by the Spanish, he demolished a Spanish ship, but 1 Spaniard was spared. Reportedly, that Spaniard was supposed to deliver a message to the governor of Cuba, saying, quote, "I shall never henceforth give quarter to any Spaniard whatsoever." In other words, no mercy will be given to the Spanish. In 1666, L'Ollonais found a new partner, Michel de Basco, with whom he had recruited over 440 buccaneers in 8 ships. His target was the city of Maracaibo, Venezuela, a valuable target that had a very well-defended fort and was thought to be impenetrable. L'Ollonais and his crew attacked from the only weak spot in the fort, the landward side. Thus, the fort was taken in a few hours. L'Ollonais was reportedly incredibly cruel, similar to the degree that Roque Basiliano was, torturing innocent civilians, pillaging and burning much of Maracaibo, with little to no gain. Much of the civilian population unfortunately died, and many of the women were raped before being killed. All of this was just an act of vengeance. They then moved to San Antonio de Gibraltar. The crew was outnumbered, but still launched a brutal attack on the garrison, slaughtering 500 soldiers and torturing and killing much of the civilian population in the same vein as Maracaibo, for personal satisfaction, not for for any particular gain. The pirates continued to ransack the city and held it for ransom. Even though the Spanish paid the ransom of around 20,000 pieces of 8, the pirates demanded more and pillaged further. The Spanish paid a total of 260,000 pieces of 8, gems, silverware, silks, and slaves to stop the crew once and for all. This has given L'Ollonais the nickname the Bane of Spain for his ferocity and cruelty. In 1667, L'Ollonais and his crew of around 700 buccaneers prepared for the next expedition. They went to the Central American mainland and pillaged a port in Honduras, where he was ambushed by a large Spanish force. He narrowly escaped and captured 2 Spaniards. He reportedly did the following to one, quote, "He drew his cutlass and with the cut opened the breast of one of those poor Spanish, and pulled out his heart with his sacrilegious hands, began to bite and gnaw it with his teeth, like a ravenous wolf, saying to the rest, I will serve you all alike if you show me not another way." The remaining men retreated back to their ship, but were unable to dislodge their stuck ship. Instead, they went further inland to look for food. From here, they attacked several towns in Guatemala and Nicaragua, which didn't prove very profitable. L'Ollonais went further south toward Colombia, where he was then captured by the natives en route in the jungles of modern-day Panama. The natives reportedly, quote, "tore him in pieces alive, throwing his body limb by limb into fire and his ashes into the air, to the intent no trace, no memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature." L'Ollonais remains as an incredibly brutal and downright terrifying person in human history, a pirate led by vengeance, going on a rampage against innocent civilians and natives, eating once poor Spaniard's heart, and dying in a similar brutal way himself, none of his riches he could reap the benefits of. He's easily the cruelest buccaneer in existence, and one of the most disturbing stories I've read.
William Fly. William Fly was a notorious British pirate raiding the coast of New England in 1726. His career was very short-lived, only being at sea for around 3 months. Fly's early life is a mystery. He only appears after he had already turned to piracy. In general, it is pretty hard to find information about this man. In April 1726, Fly was aboard a ship named the Elizabeth with Captain John Green as a regular sailor. However, he and Green clashed a lot with each other, until Fly, along with a group of mutineers, threw Green overboard and elected Fly as their new captain. Fly renamed the Elizabeth to the famous Revenge and sailed to New England, capturing 5 ships over the course of 2 months before Fly and his crew were captured themselves. After being tried for piracy, they were sentenced to hanging at Boston Harbor on 12th of July 1726. Here, Fly became famous for having complete disdain and zero remorse for his actions as a pirate, and even taunted the hangman for doing a poor job of tying his noose. Allegedly, Fly tied the noose and put it around his neck himself, saying as his last words, quote, "Our captain and his mate used us barbarously. We poor men can't have justice done us. There is nothing said to our commanders. Let them never so much abuse us and use us like dogs. All masters of vessels might take warning of the fate of the captain that he had murdered, and to pay sailors their wages when due." In other words, this was a warning to all captains to pay their sailors on time and treat them accordingly, as to not lead them to the path of piracy themselves. His body was shown off as a warning to not turn to piracy at Nix's Mate Island and Boston Harbor. Fly's death, many historians mark as the true end to the golden age of piracy, an end to a legendary era in history. Black Caesar. Alright, this is a long one. Black Caesar was an alleged legendary pirate who was renowned for being a black pirate who climbed his way out of slavery in a time where white and black men were treated unequally. In fact, piracy was a great way to earn one's way out of slavery. It is thought that of the around 10,000 pirates in the golden age of piracy, around a third were freed slaves. While most of them had to do the lowest tasks on a ship, like carrying around cargo or keeping the ship clean, many captains instated a meritocracy, a revolutionary concept in the 1700s. So many slaves were able to arm themselves, vote, and receive an equal share of the booty. Black Caesar was allegedly one of these men, though importantly, there are 2 men going by the name Black Caesar, both renowned for piracy. For simplicity, I'll refer to the later one as Caesar II. Black Caesar's early life is shrouded in mystery. As the story goes, he was tricked on board a slave trader's ship along with a few of his associates and held captive until they neared the coast of Florida. Here, the ship was hit by a hurricane, threatening to sink the ship. Caesar and a friend of his escaped on a lifeboat and survived the storm. With the small boat, they posed as shipwrecked sailors and threatened to sink the ships that came close to them if they did not give them their supplies. They continued this for a couple of years before Caesar and his friend had a fight over a woman, where Caesar killed his longtime friend. Caesar recruited pirates and attacked ships on the open sea, reportedly stashing away his supplies on an island near Old Rhodes Key, Florida. Today, one of these islands is named after him, Caesar's Rock. Here he purportedly had a harem with over 100 women and a prisoner camp full of prisoners he had hoped to ransom for large sums of money. Apparently, children were even imprisoned here, many of them having starved to death, which gave rise to the local superstition that the island is haunted. Let me clarify though that this is just a legend and no evidence has ever been found of treasure being found on or around the island. No any contemporary sources have been found. Thus, historians believe this story is purely a work of fiction. What can be known for certain is that Blackfoot did in fact serve aboard Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. He was a part of his crew when Blackbeard and Lieutenant Maynard were fighting. Charles Johnson reports, quote, Teach had little or no hopes of escaping, and therefore had posted a resolute fellow, a word, whom he had bred up with a lighted match in the parlour room, with commands to blow up when he should give him orders, which was as soon as the lieutenant and his men could have entered, that so he might have destroyed his conquerors. And when the word found how it went with Blackbeard, he could hardly be persuaded from the rash action by 2 prisoners that were then in the hold of the sloop. Whether this actually happened and Caesar was in charge of the secret operation is very dubious. In any case, after this, there are several variations to how he died. He might have died following Blackbeard's orders, or tried and sentenced to hanging in Williamsburg, Virginia, in 1718, or he might have been returned as a slave to Alexander Spotswood. By the way, last time I said Sportswood. My bad. He's actually called Spotswood. Or Caesar may have survived piracy and worked as a cooper, settling down somewhere on the east coast. We don't know for sure. Now, as mentioned earlier, there is another Black Caesar, who I'll refer to as Caesar II. This man was identified as Henri Caesar, a Haitian revolutionary and pirate born to a slave family and active in 1791, so well after the golden age of piracy. Caesar II was a part of the Haitian Revolution in 1791, which was a huge insurrection of Haitian slaves against French colonial rule. He joined the rebel forces and remained in the revolution until its end in 1804, where Haiti gained its independence from France. In 1805, he captured a Spanish ship and attacked and raided several villages and vessels near Cuba and the Bahamas from his base in Spanish Florida, before disappearing in 1830. His fate, similar to the original Black Caesar, is unknown. He may have fled from Spanish Florida after it was purchased by the US in 1821, or executed for piracy. Legends purport he buried between $2 and $6 million in Florida. In any case, the stories of both the Black Caesars are very interesting in their own right. Edge cases of black pirates working their way out of slavery and making a name for themselves in history books. They're interesting stories, though they likely are false or highly embellished. River pirates. River pirates, as the entry says, are, well, pirates operating in rivers. They are not bound to a specific region, really. They have been viewed across the globe. The Yangtze River in China has seen a lot of piracy in the 19th century until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, where Chinese insurgents attacked mainly American vessels. On Europe, the Danube River has seen a few cases of modern-day piracy. In 2006, Romanian pirates plundered Bulgarian ships, or in 2012, where cargo belonging to Ukrainian ships were taken. Perhaps most famous is American river piracy, which was mainly concentrated along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, especially in the late 1700s. From 1790 to 1834, a place named Cave and Rock in Illinois was the headquarters of American pirate activity, where Samuel Mason raised a gang of criminal outlaws and raided vessels shipping cargo down the Ohio River. Smaller gangs and lairs were wreaking havoc on merchant ships for decades afterwards, up until the 1840s in the lower Mississippi. New York City also experienced a fair share of piracy, though much smaller in comparison, even lasting until 1876. These river pirates made use of the terrain to hide from authorities, notably swamps, caves, islands, marshes, and rapids, using deception and concealment tactics to capture their treasure, which was often sold just downstream, and the crew often murdered. Flying Gang. The Flying Gang refers to a group of privateers turned pirates, outlaws, in the post-Spanish succession period. As you may know, pirate ships had to go to port at some point, mainly to refit their ships, recruit new sailors, or to restock on supplies, but they could not do this everywhere since they would risk capture by authorities. However, some ports proved to be essentially pirate safe havens due to weak local authority. One of such ports was Port Royal, a port close to modern-day Kingston in Jamaica. It was once the largest and most prosperous city in the Caribbean, but was pretty much razed to the ground by a severe earthquake on June 7, 1692, and by its accompanying tsunami. Up until then, it was considered, quote, the wickedest city on earth by many. Roche Brasiliano, for example, regularly refitted his ship in Port Royal. After the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession, which saw many privateers unemployed, and Port Royal's destruction, many made their home in Nassau or New Providence Island, and this is because of the huge Spanish treasure fleet which sank in 1715 near Florida, which attracted many privateers alike. The Flying Gang was started by veteran privateers Henry Jennings and Samuel Bellamy, who I covered in the last video, Charles Vane and Benjamin Hornigold, along with others. These pirates would raid the Spanish salvage camp which sought to, well, salvage some of the treasure that had sunk beneath the waves. This had made them insanely rich and established a de facto state on New Providence Island. While it wasn't a state in the sense we know today, it indeed governed independently from colonial powers, and the basis of governance was the informal pirate code, which was pretty progressive for its time. For example, pirates would run their ships democratically, electing their quartermasters and captains by popular vote or sharing plunder equally. Women, slaves, sailors of mixed descent, or social outcasts were able to become pirate captains. The Flying Gang was dissolved in 1718 after Governor Woodes Rogers restored British control over the region, but over the around 10 years that the Republic existed, it started the careers of legendary figures like Blackbeard or Olivier Levasseur. Victual Brothers. The Victual Brothers, German Vitalienbrüder, were a group of privateers, mainly Germans, who harassed shipping in the North and Baltic Seas in the late 14th century. They were first hired by the Dukes of Mecklenburg to support Sweden with their war efforts against Denmark, who was besieging Stockholm in 1392. The group was named after the Latin word victualia, meaning provisions, which referred to the original mission of the brothers, bringing food and supplies to Stockholm to relieve the siege. After having supplied the city with much-needed provisions, they evolved into pirates, having first occupied Gotland, an important island in the Baltic Sea, in 1394, setting up a stronghold in the city of Visby. After that, they occupied many key ports in the area, mainly Bergen, Malmö, Rostock and Wismar, and many more. During this time, they resorted to all-out piracy, and maritime trade in the area virtually collapsed, forcing Denmark to ask England for help. After Denmark united with Sweden and Norway to form the Kalmar Union, the Hanseatic League at the time was essentially forced to work with them. In 1398, the Teutonic Order invaded Gotland and drove out the Victual Brothers completely, destroying their stronghold at Visby. However, this was not the end for the Victual Brothers. Far from it, actually. Their new base of operation was mainly in the Frisian Islands off the coast of the Netherlands. Since they were driven out of the Baltic Sea, they renamed themselves to the Likedelers, meaning equal sharers, as they shared their plunder with the local coastal population. A well-known figure was Captain Nikolaus Storzenbecher, or Klaus Störtebeker. Legend has it he got his name from being able to gulp down 4 liters of beer without pausing. Störtebeker, Gottfried Michaelsen, and Magister Wigwald, along with their crews, harassed the Hanseatic League ships, irrespective of their origin. Störtebeker and his men are mostly known for their demise. In 1401, the Hamburg warship, Die Bunte Kuh, literally translating to the colorful cow, and yes, that was its actual name, tricked the crew to go to Heligoland, but were overwhelmed after a 3-day skirmish and promptly executed. Legend has it that after he was executed, his headless body got up and walked past 12 men and then fell to the ground. In 1429, some 28 years after Störtebeker's execution, the Likedelers attacked and burned the important Norwegian trading town of Bergen to the ground, and piratical activities actually continued up until 1440. Mary Read. I briefly mentioned Mary Read in Anne Bonny's entry in the last video. She's a part of John Rackham's crew, the same one Anne Bonny joined. Read's early life is unknown, and it is difficult to pinpoint her existence, as multiple women of the same name were born around the late 17th century. She might have been born in Bristol around May 1681, but this is unclear at best. We can only really rely on our beloved scholar, you guessed it, Charles Johnson for information. Reed moved to Flanders in her early adulthood and joined a cavalry regiment on the side of the Dutch against the French in the 9 Years' War. Reed disguised as a man in her service and married a soldier. Her husband, however, died shortly afterward, and Reed decided to leave the military early and moved to the Caribbean to start a new life. The ship she happened to board on was unluckily attacked by pirates, but instead of resisting, she joined the pirates while disguised as a man. She lived in Nassau, and as mentioned earlier, this was a hotspot for pirates at the time. Here she met Captain John Rackham, a renowned and feared pirate. In August 1720, Rackham, Anne Bonny and Reed stole a sloop and set it out to sea, spending around 2 months harassing and plundering ships around the Caribbean. I mentioned most of this in Anne Bonny's entry, so I'll keep it short here. Make sure to check out the last part for a more in-depth overview of their piratical activities. But the crew met their demise on the 22nd of October 1720 when Captain Jonathan Barnett took the crew by surprise and arrested them after a short skirmish. They surrendered and were brought to trial and sentenced to hang for piracy. While Reed was spared her life, as she claimed she was pregnant, she died in April 1721 in prison of unknown causes nonetheless. It is unknown whether she had actually been pregnant or died while being pregnant, but Reed, along with Anne Bonny, stay in history for being a part of the few edge cases of female pirates harassing shipments. Chui Apu. Chui Apu was a famous pirate operating in the South China Sea in the 1840s. The area became a hotspot for pirate activity during this time, mainly due to European ships trading with Chinese merchants, especially in areas like Hong Kong, which recently became a British colony in 1842. These merchants usually carried lots of opium, as the British essentially got the Chinese addicted to it, leading to the Opium Wars. The pirates attacked ships no matter the origin. If they carried opium from India, for example, it could be sold to Chinese markets. If they didn't, they usually carried some other goods, such as silver, and could be traded in for opium itself, so it really was a win-win situation for the pirates. In 1847, a fleet of Chinese pirate ships surprised a flotilla of opium-receiving ships anchored, leading to the crew being brutally murdered and their cargo being promptly carried off and sold. Similarly, the Chinese attacked their own Chinese ships as well, holding one official at ransom. One of these pirates was Chui Apu, with a force of around 50 junks. No, not the junk you know of. A junk was a type of Chinese ship during this time. He is actually said to have commanded around 500 during his lifetime, quite a large amount for any pirate. In late 1849, British Captain John C. Dalrymple Hay intended to eradicate pirate activity once and for all with his 18-gun brig named the Columbine. The pirates had been responsible for burning down a settlement near Hong Kong and fled to the village of Xiami. On September 28, Hay encountered 14 Chinese war junks in 2 lines. He positioned his ship in between the lines and opened broadsides on both lines, rendering 3 junks useless in the process. In Hay's own words, quote, "The junks refused to heave to. Gongs and drums announced their determination to fight. Stink pots were greased up, ready to throw on board. So the Columbine poured 3 well-directed broadsides into their leader. In the night, Hay gave chase to the pirates and was assisted by the steamship Canton, opening fire at the pirates. The pirates fired back and critically hit the Canton, forcing it to go to base for repairs. However, Chui Apu's fleet was scattered and 3 junks were abandoned. Another larger junk was hit critically and sank. Of the 14 junks, 4 were sunk and the rest were able to escape. Around 250 Chinese pirates were killed in the action, while 3 Royal Navy sailors were killed and another 7 were wounded. Chui Apu survived this battle, and most of his fleet was still intact. His 23-junk large fleet was anchored at Bias Bay, east of Hong Kong, but was spotted by Hay. Hay requested reinforcements, and thus the Columbine, the repaired Canton, along with the dispatched HMS Fury, attacked the pirate fleet on October 1st, 1849. The pirates attempted to flee further inland, but were trapped by the British. In the ensuing battle, all of the 24 junks were sunk, and Apu's base of operations fully fully destroyed. We don't know how the casualties look like here, but it is safe to say hundreds of pirates were killed in the action. Chui Apu initially was able to escape this battle as well, but was betrayed by his own crew and handed over to the British. He was sentenced to lifelong exile to Van Diemen's Island, modern-day Tasmania, for the murder of 2 British officers who committed suicide in a cell before his punishment was carried out. He died in Victoria Prison, Hong Kong, in 1851. Brethren of the Coast. The Brethren of the Coast were a loose group of buccaneers that formed a pirate government during the 17th and 18th centuries during the buccaneering era. They mainly operated in the West Indies. During this time, the West Indies was way more populous and flourishing than the fledgling colonies of North America, like New York or Boston. Especially in the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, the population boomed. Side note, this is considered one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Places like Germany saw a population decline of around 50%. I feel like I should make a standalone video on this war, as it really isn't in the public consciousness at all. You may know the war was mainly sparked because of the Protestant Reformation, which saw many European states convert to Protestantism, away from Catholicism. This led to a lot of violence, and Protestant communities, mainly French, British, German and Dutch, were persecuted by Catholic communities. These Protestants were given letters of marque by the governments, commissioning them to raid Catholic French and Spanish shipping routes in the Caribbean in order to disrupt their economies. This was, of course, very enticing, as they would get a chance at some of the massive wealth coming out of the Spanish Main. These privateers were soon after joined by local buccaneers, African sailors, fugitives, outlaws, thieves and criminals alike from Europe, aiming at their chance to plunder a Spanish ship or settlement full of riches. The Brethren operated mainly from 2 ports, Tortuga off the coast of Hispaniola and Port Royal on Jamaica. Tortuga was in particular a hotspot for buccaneers at the time. Around 700 to 800 buccaneers are thought to have lived there at the same time, often in very primitive conditions, unorganized and in very inaccessible areas. During the 1650s and 1660s, the buccaneers projected their power outward, attacking Spanish settlements like Santa Marta, Rio de la Hacha or Maracaibo. It is here that François L'Olonnais journeyed to Maracaibo and Gibraltar in 1666 to 1667, as mentioned in Tier 3. The local governors, especially the Jamaican and Tortugan, could not really do anything against these buccaneers, as they were extremely powerful and could not be controlled. Their governors were reliant on their buccaneers for protection against the Spanish, as well as generally being able to get a foothold in the New World. The latter reason was seen as the major reason why the French and English back in Europe did not try to stop them, instead tolerating them, although it was like playing with fire. Throughout the early 1670s, the area remained a safe haven for pirates, launching a bunch of attacks on Spanish settlements and shipments. The Brethren of the Coast are widely considered to be one of the few pirate republics. Like the Flying Gang mentioned in the last tier, the Brethren were not really a state, but more of a broad coalition of people sharing the same ideals. They were mostly Protestants after all, thus had a code of conduct progressive for its time, that being democratic elections on captainships and quartermasters, hierarchical command authority, individual rights, equal share of plunder, and legislative decision-making. One man you'll often hear when talking about the Brethren is Henry Morgan, a buccaneer who is widely considered the de facto leader of the coalition, being the one who influenced the unwritten pirate code of the time. In the end, the Brethren waned in power, mainly due to the Treaty of Madrid, signed in 1670, where the English renounced their claims in the Caribbean, but also rise in slave labor, stronger local governments, and socio-economic and military changes in the late 17th century led to the eventual disappearance of the Brethren of the Coast and Tortuga and Port Royal in its entirety. Baymen. The Baymen were a group of mostly English buccaneers from Jamaica settling in what is now modern-day Belize. The first Baymen settled along the coast in the 1630s, and gradually settlements increased over the decades. The coastal area was pretty resource-rich at the time, and settlers were able to make a living off of cutting and selling logwood abroad. In the small settlements, the English employed slavery as their main method of cutting logs. It was pretty informal and laissez-faire in how it worked. They could have their own plantations, but they also also often relied on their master for food and supplies, but this depended largely on the master's personality. During this time, however, Central America was mostly governed by the Captaincy General of Guatemala, which was loyal to the Spanish crown, and thus the Spanish saw this as an act of aggression by the English. The reason this is on the iceberg is because these settlers would often engage in guerrilla warfare and small clashes with the Spanish, outrunning and persisting local authorities. They built a sort of pirate haven north of Belize City, sometimes launching attacks on ships entering the Spanish Main, hoping to seize some of the immense wealth treasure fleets would carry. One of the first famous baymen was Scottish buccaneer Peter Wallace, who was one of the first baymen to venture the area around 1638. Side note, the modern-day country of Belize is thought to have gotten its name from this particular pirate. The Spanish called Wallace Willis, Walix or Valis, morphing into Balis, and finally ending up at Belize over the centuries. Just a fun fact I found while researching. With the population growing steadily, he and the baymen developed a system of government called the public meeting. I can't seem too much information about how the system worked, but I assume it is similar to that of the Brethren of the Coast. Over the decades, more skirmishes with the Spanish ensued, leading the baymen to be driven out of Belize at least 4 times between 1717 and 1780, to the signing of multiple treaties allowing the baymen to stay in the area as long as the British would evacuate their subjects elsewhere. This did happen, but formal control was established after the Battle of St. George's Cay in 1798, where the baymen, with the help of their own slaves, won out against the Spanish. Over the decades, logwood diminished and the baymen had to explore the jungles deeper, clashing with the native Maya and Garifuna populations frequently, though it slowly calmed down by the end of the 19th century. All things considered, the baymen seem to be pretty unknown, at least I've never heard of them, and it is an interesting look at how the British tried to assert control over Central America and siphon off of Spain's riches. Joseph Bradish. Joseph Bradish was a famous pirate rounder and an associate of William Kidd, mentioned in Tier 2. Bradish was born in Sudbury or Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the 28th of November 1672. Yet again, nothing is known of his life before being a pirate, but we do know he signed as a mate on the Hague boat known as the Adventure, which was bound for the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia. The Adventure's captain, Thomas Gullock, was extremely unpopular in his crew, including Bradish, who then organized a mutiny against him, stopping at the Moluccas, more well known as the Spice Islands back then. The mutineers dropped their loyalists off on an island and sailed away with a ship numbering around 25 men. The mutineers then elected Bradish as their captain and shared the treasures they had found in the storeroom, which is said to have been filled with 9 chests. News of this spread back in England, even stating a petition in Parliament, quote, "The humble petition of Samuel Shepherd, Gilbert Heathcote and Henry Tate, in behalf of themselves and others, owners of the ship Adventure and cargo, whereof Thomas Gullock was commander, when the captain with 14 of his men were ashore on the island of Nayas on the coast of Sumatra to take in some fresh water. The major part of the seamen on board seized upon the chief mate and some others whom they sent ashore, and then cut the cable and ran off with the ship. In hopes of finding the said ship in the West Indies, the Majesty has already ordered a 6th-rate frigate to sail for New England." Bradish and his crew were then headed to Nassau on Long Island, New York State. En route, they refitted and resupplied on Mauritius and Ascension. Finally arriving on March 19, 1699, they hired local sloops to offload their treasure and promptly scuttled the Adventure. The crew bought local horses and rode away on horseback, disappearing. Bradish, however, was not as lucky. He hoped to receive a pardon for his piracy, but was promptly arrested in Boston. While at first he was able to escape jail due to a relative of his being the jailer, he was recaptured on October 1699. He was actually put in the same jail which held William Kidd, and it seemed like Bradish was a fan of Kidd, since Kidd's ship was named the Adventure Prize, while Bradish's was simply the Adventure, and he pretty much sailed the same route as Kidd did. What might have been a coincidence? Who knows? In any case, Bradish's and Kidd's crew was shipped off to England in March 1700 and tried, convicted, and hanged soon afterward at Hope Dock in London, though some allege his treasure can still be found strewn across New England. Chung Po Tsai. Chung Po Tsai was a Chinese pirate operating in the South China Sea, born sometime around 1783, probably in Jinhui in southern China. He was a poor fisherman's son till he was kidnapped by a pirate Zheng Yi or Cheng Yat at the age of 15. Po Tsai quickly adjusted to the pirate life and began to enjoy his duties, rising through the ranks, even getting adopted by Cheng Yat and his wife, Ching Shi. Cheng Yat suddenly died in a storm off the coast of Vietnam in 1807, prompting the now widow Ching Shi to maneuver Po Tsai into a leadership position. Shi became Po Tsai's right-hand man, became lovers, and eventually married. And remember, Shi was Po Tsai's stepmother. So, in any case, Po Tsai and his fleet harassed shipping in the South China Sea around Guangdong coastal areas. I don't know how large his fleet was at this time, but I found numbers ranging from around 20,000 to as many as 70,000 sailors, with upwards of 600 to 1,800 ships. Information is pretty unclear about this. His influence was massive, and he and his crew became extremely wealthy and powerful in the area, so much so in fact that Po Tsai aspired to become the Emperor of China, or a sort of god figure, since his pirates believed in a fringe sect. Po Tsai's fleet often clashed with European ships, namely the Portuguese, and suffered a heavy defeat against the Portuguese lieutenant Pereira Barreta in May 1807. The Portuguese continued to be a thorn in their side, as they suffered a series of defeats at the Battle of the Tiger's Mouth. Numbers are not available, but we can assume losses were pretty heavy on the pirate side. During this battle, legends say he hid his treasures hastily in a cave nearby, now known as, who guessed it, Chung Po Tsai's cave, though no treasure has ever been uncovered there. After 1810, Po Tsai and Shi accepted amnesty by the Qing government, ending their piratical activities and keeping their loot. Po Tsai joined Qing's Guangdong Navy and achieved the rank of colonel, given command of around 30 ships and a private fleet. He spent the rest of his life fighting other pirates in the South China Sea for the Qing government. Po Tsai and Shi had 2 children together, the first being born in 1813 and the second one being born at an unknown later date. Chung Po Tsai died at sea in 1822 at the age of 39, and his widowed wife opened a gambling house in mainland China. Po Tsai and Shi remain as important figures in piracy in the South China Sea and piracy history as a whole, as they commanded one of the largest pirate fleets ever, numbering tens of thousands of pirates and hundreds of ships, terrorizing shipping at sea and turning against piracy later on. Grace O'Malley. Grace O'Malley was a female Irish pirate born around 1530 in County Mayo, Western Ireland, gaining infamy as Ireland's pirate queen. She was the daughter of O'Malley's chieftain Owen Dubhdara O'Malley, a clan very proficient in seafaring. The clan's territory spanned areas along the coastline of County Mayo, mainly along Clew Bay, a body of water with many small isles strewn around. From an early age, she learned how to sail and gained extensive knowledge on life on a boat, taking part in plundering and piracy missions. She was raised in family castles near Belclare and Clare Island, probably being taught how to read and write at a local monastery. Her plundering led her as far south as Spain and as far north as the Outer Hebrides near Scotland, mainly picking up cattle for her clan. Her galleys took inspiration from Viking longships, being very large and fitting as many as 200 men, while also being very maneuverable and versatile. O'Malley and her clan traded a lot with the Spanish, trading iron, weapons and wine in exchange for fish, hides and fleeces, building a small trade route. Often she would plunder ships that she thought passed illegally through her waters. In addition, the western coast of Ireland was frequently attacked by North African pirates, which she helped fend off. When the Tudors invaded islands around the 1570s, Ireland's old Gaelic customs and traditions were washed away and replaced with English ones, which took a huge toll on O'Malley. The governor of the province her family lived in, Connacht, was especially antagonistic of her family. Sir Richard Bingham, he was called, sought to destroy the piratical activities in her family, so much so that O'Malley's eldest son, Owen, was murdered by Bingham's brother. Bingham offered the O'Malleys a truce, but this turned out to be a trick. As Bingham captured Grace and condemned her as a traitor and to death, she was luckily rescued by a family member though. Determined by vengeance, Grace went into full-on rebellion against the English and fled to Ulster. She sought help from the Spanish to drive the English out of Ireland and unite the Irish people once again. In 1588, because of bad weather, the Spanish could not support the Irish rebels. Bingham proclaims an all-out war against the O'Malleys and calls Grace, quote, the nurse to all rebellions in Ireland. In 1591, Bingham sinks a large part of O'Malley's fleet by employing scorched earth tactics, severely weakening her rebelling capabilities. In 1593, Grace's youngest son, Tibbet, was captured by Bingham, charged with treason, a crime punishable by death, and imprisoned in Athlone Castle. This is when Grace decides to embark on a voyage that would put her in her history books. She would sail around the south coast of Ireland and around England, into the Thames and to the Greenwich Palace, to seek a meeting with Queen Elizabeth I. In September, However, she sat down in court with Elizabeth I, and despite all the charges of piracy and treason against her, Grace secured her son's release, her stolen lands returned, and was allowed to continue her career at sea. Even at old age, she was still sailing the seas, but died peacefully at the age of 73 in Rockfleet Castle, Ireland. She remains a legendary figure in Irish history. The Lost Treasure of Lima. The Lost Treasure of Lima is a legendary buried treasure reportedly going missing somewhere en route to Mexico from Peru in 1820. Spain at this time was beginning to lose grip on its New World colonies. As with most things in European history, this can be traced back to Napoleon. Napoleonic France waged war across Europe and invaded Spain in the Peninsular War in 1807, proving a crushing blow to the Spanish monarchy and ushering in wars for independence all over South America. Peru was no exception to this. The city of Lima in particular, today the largest city and capital city of Peru, was back then also a large population center and crucial trading port, and was on the brink of rebellion. The Viceroy of Lima, basically the Spanish colonial governor of the area, preemptively decided to evacuate the city's most valuable treasures to Mexico for safekeeping, most of it belonging to the Catholic Church. This treasure included altar trimmings coated with gemstones, 5 relic containers, 3 of which made of pure gold, containing over 1400 gemstones, including over a dozen diamonds, thousands of coins, silver, candlesticks, and 2 life-sized solid gold statues of Mary holding the baby Jesus. Collectively, it is valued between 12 and 60 million US dollars. In today's money, this would be around $1 billion. The Viceroy thought it was a good idea to enlist an Englishman to transport this immense haul, as the English had no ties with the revolutionaries, but the English captain, William Thompson, captain of the ship Mary Dear, could not resist the temptation and turned pirate. Allegedly, Thompson remarked to his crew, quote, "We can work as we please the rest of our lives, boys, and not all of us together can ever produce for ourselves as much wealth as there is in one of those big boxes. The fellows who hired us to hold this cargo for them are thieves. They stole all this gold. Let's take it from them and put it to good use. What is the will of the crew?" The crew agreed and threw the soldiers and priests overboard and headed for the Cocos Island, off the coast of Costa Rica. This is the place the treasure, or at least part of it, was allegedly buried for safekeeping. The crew split up and laid low till the situation calmed down. However, the Mary Dear was captured and the crew went on trial for piracy. The Spanish hanged the entire crew, except for Thompson and his first mate James Forbes. In exchange for letting them live, the Spanish made their way to Cocos Island with Thompson and his mates, but then managed to slip out of their grip and escaped into the dense jungles. Thompson, Forbes, and the treasure were never seen again. It is believed Thompson got on a boat to Newfoundland, Canada, and Forbes made his way to California, settling down and never returning to the island. Hundreds of amateur and professional treasure hunters have traveled to Cocos Island, attempting to uncover this treasure, unsuccessfully. Most notably, German treasure hunter August Gisler became obsessed with the treasure and spent around 20 years searching, but only found a few gold coins. Today, the treasure still remains buried somewhere. However, the Costa Rican government believes no such treasure exists on Cocos Island and does not allow any more treasure hunting in order to protect the mostly untouched jungles. Some believe the treasure is instead buried on a small unknown island off the coast of South America, but we may never know the truth as it is lost to history. John Durdrake. John Durdrake, known as Jack of the Baltic, was a legendary Danish pirate that might have been active in the 1700s. We don't know if he was a real person, but as the story goes, he originally worked as a carpenter at a dockyard in Copenhagen before being fired for drunkenness. After his parents died, he inherited a small fortune, with which he decided to commission a fast-sailing brig sheathed with copper. Durdrake tried selling wood between Norway and London, but this proved to be too unprofitable and decided to offer his services to Peter I, more known as Peter the Great of Russia. On the royal dockyards of Neva, he got into a fight with one of his superiors, took an axe and allegedly killed him, hurrying off with the ship afterwards and selling the Russian cargo on the ship to the British. Afterwards, he left for Norway, but was attacked by a Russian man-of-war en route, which was defeated and surrendered. Durdrake used this Russian warship as his new flagship and left his smaller ship. He manned this ship with around 70 sailors, of which 35 English and the rest Danish and Norwegian sailors, and and renamed it to the ominous name Sudden Death. In the Baltic and North Seas, he plundered several merchant ships, taking valuable cargoes like fittings for ships, arms, or wool clothes, and sold most of this to Swedish merchants. Deirdre is said to have made his prisoners walk the plank, in other words, making them drown. One such prisoner survived and spread Deirdre's stories, prompting General Scheveling, governor of St. Petersburg, to send out 2 ships. When the pirates received this news, they were just ready to take on a Russian vessel bound for Kronstadt, near St. Petersburg. This particular ship held the sister of Scheveling, who was subsequently stabbed to death by Deirdre in revenge for her brother's doings. Upon hearing the news of his sister's death, Scheveling sent out 2 well-armed ships, which, finding the sudden death anchored, fought and sunk her. Deirdre at this time was on shore and escaped, but most, if not everyone from his crew, was killed in battle or hanged afterwards. Deirdre escaped to Stralsund in northern Germany, bought an estate, and ended up living peacefully for 14 years, until one day he made the mistake of traveling to Stockholm, where he was recognized by a captain of a Swedish ship who had given information about him. He was then arrested, tried, convicted of piracy, and hanged at port. In the end, it seems like the story of Deirdre is either fully or partly made up. In the historic records, there is no governor of St. Petersburg going by Scheveling, and Peter I died in 1725. Also, copper sheathing was not in use until the mid to late 1700s. It is very unlikely the story happened as it did, but perhaps it was an oral myth floating around, and its details expanded upon with similarly hazy details, perhaps making for a good cautionary tale or story to tell one's friends, but probably not something that actually happened. Zheng Yi Sao. Zheng Yi Sao, or Qing Shi, was the stepmother, later wife of Jeyung Po Tsai, mentioned earlier. For simplicity, I'll keep referring to her as Qing Shi, which was one of the many variations to her name. She was a renowned pirate in her own right, especially rising to fame for being a woman in a heavily male-dominated industry. In fact, she's considered history's most successful female pirate and among the most successful pirates overall. Shi was born in 1775 near Jinhui in Guangdong, southern China, and may have been working on a flower boat before turning to piracy. A flower boat was a euphemism for a floating brothel that serviced merchants, sailors, and officials. In 1801, Zheng Yi, a very powerful pirate at the time, visited this brothel and was captivated by Shi's beauty and wit, and they soon married. They adopted Jeyung Po Tsai as their son. 4 years later, in July 1805, the pirates operating in the South China Sea were united in a confederation through an agreement, sacrificing some of their individual power for the greater good. The confederation consisted of 6 fleets, each of them assigned a unique color on their flags: red, black, blue, white, yellow, and purple. Zheng Yi commanded the largest fleet, the 200-ship large Red Flag Fleet. After Zheng Yi's sudden death in 1807, many expected the pirate confederation to splinter and collapse entirely. Instead, Shi was able to hold on to power and became the de facto leader of the entire confederation, balancing everyone's power. While Po Tsai was the official commander of the Red Fleet, Shi operated in the shadows and had in effect the actual power. Sometime in 1807, they both married. It is unclear whether this was purely of romantic or sexual interest, or a strategically planned marriage to secure power. In any case, Shi solidified her command over the fleets. It is reported that, quote, Jeyung Po Tsai obeyed Qing Shi's orders and consulted her on all things before acting. In the next year, the Confederation became significantly more active and ballooned in size and power. It is estimated the fleets grew from around 200 ships to a staggering armada of 1,800 ships manned by around 70,000 pirates. Though it is important to mention information is really scarce on this, and the actual number might have been something like 800 ships and 40,000 pirates. Still a huge fleet in any definition of the word huge. In mid-1809, the Pirate Confederation was dealt a huge blow to their fleet, as a Qing fleet essentially wiped out the White Flag Fleet, along with 24 of Po Tsai's ships. This did not deter Shi, though. As a revenge, Shi ordered a massive counterattack in Guangdong province. 3 fleets would attack in 3 different locations, with Shi taking command of her own personal fleet. This attack, commencing in August, worked its way up rivers and along the coastal areas for over 6 weeks and caused death totals of up to 10,000 people. In early September, Po Tsai delivered a large victory against the Qing Navy, sinking several ships, destroying a large town, killing 2,000 civilians and pillaging numerous settlements and towns along the way. Over the next months, the Confederation kept crippling the coastal areas of China and Qing's navy. In the end, her fate was shared with both sides. In 1810, the Pirate Confederation negotiated a surrender with the Qing government, receiving pardons for their entire crew. In the following years, she opened a gambling house in Canton, where she was gifted land by the government. She died at the age of 68 or 69, having led a relatively peaceful life after her pirate era. Dionysius the Phocæan. Dionysius the Phocæan was an admiral of ancient Greece during the Persian Wars of the 5th century BC. Basically nothing is known of his early life. We only know he was born in the town of Phocaea, an Ionian settlement in modern-day Turkey. That's it. The only source we have on this is from the famed Greek historian Herodotus. His adulthood was littered with struggles. During the mid-500s BC, Ionian settlements rebelled against the Persians who were occupying them. The Ionians gathered together a fleet and put Dionysius in command. They joined the main Greek force at the port of Lade. Delivering a speech, he aimed to boost his men's morale. Quote, "Now for our affairs are the razor's edge, men of Ionia, whether we are to be free or slaves. So if you will bear hardships now, you will suffer temporarily, but be able to overcome your enemies." Despite trying his hardest to make the Greeks willing to engage the upcoming naval battle against the Persians, almost 120 out of the 350 Greek warships abandoned the battle, leaving the rest to be annihilated by the Persians. This was an absolute disaster for the Greeks, and their naval capabilities could never hope to match the Persians in a one-to-one combat again. In wake of this predicament, Dionysius resorted to piracy. He used a small navy of 3 warships westward, anchoring in Sicily, where they set up their base of operations. He became active against Carthaginian and Tersinian merchants, mainly Etruscans and Punic shipping, though he left the Greeks alone. Not much is known about him after this, and it is believed he continued his piratical activities till dying on sea or dying of old age. In any case, Dionysius is an example that piracy is as old as time itself. Like mentioned at the very top of the iceberg, if there is a ship and a crew, there is bound to be piracy involved. This is living proof of that. Dionysius was probably a very pragmatic man. A man using his circumstances to achieve the best possible result. He knew he could never match the Persians with this tiny navy, so he resorted to the best possible plan B, that is, outmaneuvering enemies and attacking vulnerable shipping lines. He probably also got rich off of this, as many pirates did, but it is unclear how his fate was. Quite a painful cliffhanger, I know, but this is sadly lost to history. Polycrates. Polycrates was the tyrant of Samos from the 540s BC to 522 BC and went down in history of a stereotypical tyrannical ruler. Though it is important to mention the main source of his life is from the aforementioned Greek historian Herodotus. Since it is the only source, the account is likely to be embellished or changed in order to make a point. In Herodotus' case, it would be to covertly denounce Athens' imperialism at the time, as Polycrates lived more than a century removed from Herodotus. In any case, he, along with a small force of only 17 men, 2 of which were his brothers, took power in a coup. Initially, they ruled in unison, but Polycrates seized power for himself after murdering both his brothers. At the very start of his rule, he owned a force of 1,000 archers and 100 Pentecostals, versatile, long-range ships used for sea trade, piracy, and warfare. This, at the time, was the largest fleet in the Greek world. Herodotus writes, quote, "For Polycrates was the first of the Hellenes of whom we have any knowledge, who set his mind upon having command of the sea, excepting the deities of Greek mythology. Of that which we call mortal race, Polycrates was the first, and he had great expectation of becoming ruler of Ionia and of the islands." Not much of his naval activities have been preserved. Herodotus refers to an attack on Miletus, an influential Greek city at the time, being attacked by the lesbians. No, not those lesbians. I mean the lesbians from the island of Lesbos, winning a great victory over them, and enslaving a large number of lesbian soldiers. In addition, Herodotus reports of Polycrates aiding Egyptian pharaoh Amasis II in conquering Cyprus. But it is important to mention ancient historians did not focus on single campaigns or battles, but reported more wide-ranging events. So Polycrates might have not, and probably did not, engage in traditional naval combat, but was more of a pirate than an admiral. In fact, Herodotus writes, quote, "For to whatever part he directed his forces, everything went fortunately for him, and he plundered from all, making no distinction of any. For it was his wont to say that he would win more gratitude from his friends by giving back to him that which he had taken than by not taking at all. In other words, a friend would be more appreciative if what was taken from him was returned than if it had not been snatched away. Herodotus states Polycrates later established a fleet of 40 triremes, probably the first Greek state to ever do so. Polycrates readied up for a major war against the Persians, but this never materialized, as he was tricked to go to Magnesia. In Magnesia, he was assassinated by Oroetes, a local Persian governor, though it is unclear as to how he was killed. Herodotus only states it was an undignified end to a ruler. Many historians believe he may have been impaled or even crucified. In the end, Polycrates went down in history as an ancient tyrant pirate ruler. Sadly, it is unclear how much of his naval supremacy impacted maritime trade in the area. We have no numbers or events of single naval engagements, but one can assume it was enough to at least cripple trade in the Aegean Sea. This is another case, just like the last entry, of an ancient pirate, proving once again piracy is ever present in recorded history. Teuta of Illyria. Queen Teuta was the ruler of the Illyrian kingdom from approximately 231 BC to 228 or 227 BC. Her name means something like Mistress of the People, or simply Queen. In the early Roman period, piracy was a very prevalent thing in the Mediterranean, especially where Illyria is located, which is modern-day Croatia. The Adriatic has many hidden inlets and bays, in which pirates would often hide in. The Illyrian kingdom grew considerably in the 200s BC, occupying what is modern-day Croatia, parts of Bosnia, Montenegro, and Albania. Queen Teuta is often considered the pirate queen of antiquity, but this is a bit misleading. She did not partake in piracy at all. She merely condoned, perhaps pushed it. For the Illyrians, including high society, piracy was seen as part of their culture and customs, seeing it as a legal profession, just like, for example, a carpenter was. In fact, 2 Roman envoys tried to negotiate an end to the piracy, as mainly Roman merchants were affected by this. Reportedly, Teuta said, quote, "It is contrary to the custom of the Illyrian kings to hinder their subjects from winning booty from the sea." As the attendants made their way back to Rome, Teuta allegedly ordered to kill an envoy that was outraged at her statements. This news spread to Rome, and this was enough of a reason for Rome to gear up and prepare for war against the Illyrians. In 229, Rome declared war on Illyria. An army of around 20,000 troops, 200 cavalry units, and a Roman fleet of around 200 ships were sent to conquer Illyria once and for all. Teuta was not prepared for this at all, as most of her fleet was standby at a Greek colony, raiding merchant ships in the Ionian Islands. The commander of this fleet betrayed Illyria and surrendered to the Romans, prompting the Romans to conquer coastal areas of Illyria. Before sieging the capital, Scotra, Teuta retreated to a fort and negotiated a peace treaty in early spring 228 BC, where she paid annual tribute to the Romans, and the Romans would get some coastal areas in Illyria. But this officially stopped piratical activities. The Illyrians would rise up once again, however could not stop further Roman incursions into mainland Illyria, eventually conquering it altogether. Teuta would abdicate data in 227. It's important to keep in mind that most, if not all, of these accounts come from mainly Roman sources. The Romans were, understandably, pretty hostile toward the Illyrians, so some accounts of her should be taken with a grain of salt, as they might be biased. And sadly, we don't really have sources about the extent of the piracy really was. Once again, ancient historians usually didn't record singular piratical activities. The rise of Rome meant the steady decline of piracy in the Mediterranean over the centuries. It's no coincidence the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, as they had a firm grip of what went on in the Mediterranean. Thus, when the Western Roman Empire fell in the 3rd century CE, piracy became more prevalent once again. Saida al-Hurra. Saida al-Hurra was one of the most famous female pirates of all time of Andalusian origin, modern-day southern Spain, and is considered one of the most important female figures of the Muslim West. Her name, really a title, loosely translates to independent noble lady, or the woman sovereign who exercises power. Her birth date is disputed, but it is estimated to be around 1485 to 1495. The late 1400s were a tumultuous time in Europe, as Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama found a route to India around Africa. With this discovery, Morocco was suddenly no longer a powerful middleman in European-Asian trade, and the trade routes became less and less traveled. Thus, the economic and political sphere changed. Less soldiers were stationed in trading hubs, leading to Castilian and Aragonian armies conquering the Kingdom of Granada in 1492, ending almost 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia. Many families, including that of Saida, were expelled from their homeland. This led to waves of refugees being absorbed by North African settlements, namely those in Morocco. Saida's family fled to Chefchaouen, I don't know if that's right, a city located in the Rif Mountains, in order to flee from the Spanish Reconquista. Saida's family was a part of a noble clan known as the Rashids, who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. In Chefchaouen, she received a good education and lived a comparably happy and peaceful childhood. She reportedly excelled in languages, including Castilian, Spanish, and Portuguese, as well as showing major interest in theology. In 1510, she married Abu Hassan al-Mandari, the then governor of Tetuan, since 1505. Tetuan at this time was an important port, a fortified town also serving as a tactical base from which to launch maritime raids. In fact, the Portuguese razed it in 1400. A man named Al-Mandari rebuilt it and restored the city's importance once again, somewhere in the 1580s. However, it is unclear whether this Al-Mandari was the Al-Mandari Saida had married, or perhaps a son or nephew. In any case, Saida learned a lot from her husband, assisting him in business affairs. She was a de facto vice-governor and used her wit to establish herself as an independent political leader in a world dominated by men at the time. This was nigh unheard of, but very impressive indeed. Even today, her husband died in 1515. By that time she held the role of governor of Tetuan herself. During her reign, the city reached an unheard level of prosperity. How did she do this? Well, you're watching a video about pirates, so you can probably figure it out yourself. She never really forgot the humiliation she faced when fleeing Granada from the Spanish invaders, and thus piracy was her way of taking revenge on the quote Christian enemy. Saida established an alliance with a man named Hayreddin Barbarossa of Algiers, famed admiral and corsair of the Ottoman Empire. These two proved to be a great team. Spanish sources dating from 1540 recount attacks on Gibraltar and the loss of much booty and prisoners, for whom Saida demanded ransom. The Portuguese meanwhile, quote, prayed to God to allow them to see her hanged from a ship's mast. Sebastian de Vargas, a royal envoy to the Portuguese court, characterized her as, quote, a very aggressive and bad-tempered woman about everything. It is safe to assume that during these years, the Western Mediterranean was heavily controlled by Saida's and Barbarossa's fleets, though it is important to mention that Morocco itself did not have a navy and solely depended on mainly Ottoman privateers seeking treasure from the Spanish and Portuguese. Her power waned in 1541 as she became more and more aggressive with her foreign policy, prompting the governor of Ceuta, another important trading port at the time, controlled by the Portuguese, to cut off ties with her. This resulted in merchants being angered by bad business and resulting in Saida's son-in-law Mulay Ahmed al-Hassan al-Mandari, allying with tribal forces and usurping Saida. What happened afterwards is not entirely clear, though many speculate she retired in her hometown of Chefchaouen, accepting her fate and living the rest of her life peacefully till her death sometime around 1552. In the end, her story became legendary. She was incredibly important for stability in the region, as it was feared the Spanish and Portuguese would continue with their invasion into Morocco, which they partly did. To be fair, she fended off these invaders by building up a force to be reckoned with, a force that matched the Christians, building a sort of bastion of Muslim rule in the region. While she was not directly involved in piracy, she did highly push and endorse it, just like Teuta of Illyria. Whether or not to call her a pirate, however, is another debate. As historians argue, it is not really fair to call it piracy if a local state is trying to defend themselves from a potential incoming colonial invasion. In the end, she is, again, one of a few female pirates in history to build up a reputation for themselves in a world dominated by men. Al-Qasimi. Al-Qasimi, plural Al-Qawasim, is an Arab dynasty and tribe, forming two of the 7 modern-day emirates of the United Arab Emirates. They were founded in 1722 and have since then remained as one of the longest-reigning royal families in the Arab world. They are traditionally situated along the Persian Gulf, which has been a hotspot for piratical activities ever since the dawn of civilization, really. going as far back as 1000 BC. Over the decades, the Al-Qasimi increased their naval capabilities and controlled several islands in the Persian Gulf in the late 18th century. The British were interested in the region and encountered the Qawasim in 1778, though I have found sources calling this into question. We do know that the local tribes launched more attacks in the early 1800s, driven by political instability and cultural differences between local powers, even plundering a British ship that was wrecked due to a storm. In 1803, the Napoleonic Wars broke out in Europe, leading Britain to divert much of their naval strength from the Persian Gulf to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. This made the local tribes, especially the Qawasim, even stronger in the area, as their main competitor was now distracted elsewhere. In 1805, the Qawasim captured two large ships, Shannon and Trimmer, after swarming the ships and killing their crews, converting the Trimmer into a pirate ship. A British warship, HCS Mornington, attempted to recapture Trimmer, but failed, as nearly 40 Al-Qasimi vessels attacked the Mornington, barely escaping total destruction. Al-Qasimi pirate ships continued to launch attacks against ships in the area, leading to a large spike of piratical activities in 1808 and 1809. It is estimated that during this time, the Qawasim forces included 60 large bagalas, which looked like this, over 800 dhows, and 19,000 men against just two British warships, the aforementioned Mornington and Teignmouth. It was now the Qawasim who really controlled the area, no longer the British nor the French, who tried to contact new allies in order to combat the British. So much so, in fact, that the British named the area the Pirate Coast. Following these raids, the British in India decided to make a significant show of force against the Qawasim, gathering a fleet of 8 warships, 1 ketch, 2 Royal Navy frigates, as well as troops from 2 battalions, Marines, engineers, and artillerymen, all leaving Bombay on September 17th. The British flotilla arrived off of the town of Ras Al Khaimah on the 11th of November, bombarding the town and making amphibious landings on the shores of the harbour. After driving the Arabs back, the harbour was secured and over 50 Al-Qasimi vessels, including 30 large bagalas, were burnt down, along with the ammunition stores and fortifications razed. By the morning of November 14, the operation was complete and the British forces returned to their ships, having only suffered minor casualties. Only 5 were killed and 34 wounded, while the Arabs likely suffered heavy casualties, the exact numbers unknown. But considering more than half of the Qawasim large ships were destroyed at port, it probably was significant. Some minor British attacks occurred a couple days later, burning down dozens of Qawasim ships and killing their crews. In one attack, the British bombarded a local fort. With their defenders consistently refusing to surrender, they incurred heavy casualties of around 1,000 men. The operations were continued into 1810 until a peace treaty was signed between the Al-Qasimi and the British. This did not curb pirate activity by the Al-Qasimi in the area at all. It merely put it on a halt. The British left the area again and moved their forces to Java in 1811, making the Al-Qasimi pirates return in force, though much weaker than before. The British saw this as a major threat to their vulnerable shipping. This treaty fully broke down in 1815. As historian J.G. Lorimer remarks, quote, "The Qawasim now indulged in a carnival of maritime lawlessness to which even their own previous record presented no parallel." Side note, it is very hotly debated, even to this day, whether the Al-Qasimi were actually this piratical as the British remark. The truth is that the political sphere in this area was very splintered, and current ruler of Sharjah, Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi, contests this in his book The Myth of Arab Piracy in the Gulf, calling into question whether Al-Qasimi activity can be classified as piracy. In any case, the British launched another expedition in November 1819, embarking to Ras Al Khaimah with around 3,000 British soldiers and 600 of Muscat soldiers, one of them being famed pirate Rahma ibn Jabir. Remember this guy? This expedition proved to be a failure for the Qawasim, ending in yet another peace treaty. Minor piratical activities continued up until 1835. A truce was signed every year until 1853, when a treaty was signed with the British and their local sheiks, agreeing to a perpetual maritime truce, in which the British would also refer to the coastal area as the Crucial Coast, instead of the earlier Pirate Coast. Despite the treaties, piracy still remained a problem in the late 19th and early 20th century, but gradually waned and pretty much was wiped out. In the end, the Al-Qasimi were renowned pirates during this time, raiding mainly British shipping and stalling trade in a very strategically important area, though again, calling them pirates is a bit dubious and is still hotly disputed today. Jazim bin Jabir. Jazim bin Jabir, also known as Rakraki, was a 19th century pirate active in the Persian Gulf. Bin Jabir had his base in Khor al-Aidad, a small inlet in modern-day Qatar, attacking British shipping. In 1836, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, Khalifa bin Shaprut, received permission from the British to attack and bombard the pirate settlement, killing 50 men and razing its houses and fort. Rakraki escaped and took refuge in Doha, having seized a British ship en route. As a consequence, the British sent a squadron consisting of the steam frigate Sesostris, the Crude, an 18-gun sloop of war, and the Tigris, a 10-gun brig, under Commodore Braggs. Braggs demanded the surrender of the pirate and a fine of £300. After a short bombardment, Rakraki's ship was handed over and publicly burned, with some of his leftover property confiscated. What happened afterwards is a mystery. In fact, this man is a mystery altogether. In my research, I barely found anything pertaining or even mentioning this man. This man is so obscure, there is literally nothing besides this I have been able to dig up. If you have more information about this man, feel free to leave a comment below. I feel like I should tell you guys more, but I really did try. Sorry, I guess. Rahma ibn Jabir al-Jalhami, wow, was an Arab ruler in the Persian Gulf region, born sometime around 1760 near modern-day Kuwait. Rahma's father, Jabin bin Atbi, led the Jalhami tribe to Bahrain Island after agreeing to take it over with 2 other tribes. While the invasion was successful, the Jalhami tribe was dissatisfied, saying they had not been getting their appropriate share of the pie and had a falling out with the other tribes. Soon after, Rahma took over the leadership of his tribe and sought to get revenge on what was, in his eyes, rightfully his. This was sometime in the 1780s, and for the next 20 years we hear nothing from Rahma. We can assume Rahma consolidated his forces and adopted piracy during this time as his main way to exercise power in the area. As said in the previous entries, the Persian Gulf was, and still is, an extremely important choke point for trade. Back then in particular, the British would trade a lot of valuable goods to and from their colonies in Asia, namely India, making piracy a powerful tool for local leaders. He was evidently pretty successful in using exactly this. He acquired a new vessel, a 300-ton ship manned by 350 men, which would become his flagship, named the Al-Manowar, derived from the English man of war. Rahma in particular was the most powerful leader in the early 1800s, as he influenced the Saudis to launch an invasion in Bahrain in 1809. And as you may remember, in 1809, the British launched an offensive against the Al-Qasimi, severely weakening them, and thus making Rahma an influential leader in the area. In 1816, he allied himself with the rulers of Muscat in the invasion of Bahrain. And remember, Bahrain was his main target, since he was eyeing it up ever since his tribe was unequally treated years prior. Even though he broke his alliance with the Saudis because of this, it did not matter to him, as long as he fought against Bahrain. The invasion however failed, and the Saudis destroyed his fort, prompting him to take refuge in Bushehr in modern-day Iran, taking 500 families with him. Importantly, Rahma avoided attacking British ships so as to not incur their anger. He knew the British were far more powerful and instead allied with them in the British Gulf Campaign of 1819, where the British fought against the Al-Qasimi. Like mentioned earlier, it's not really clear how much his tribe contributed in this campaign. Sources are really scarce on this topic in general. It is safe to say the British were pretty fond of him, as English traveller and author James Silk Buckingham wrote, quote, "Rahma was the most successful and the most general tolerated pirate, perhaps, that ever infested any sea." Furthermore, Buckingham said the following about Rahma's appearance, quote, "Rahma's figure presented a meager trunk with 4 lank members, all of them cut and hacked and pierced with wounds of sabres, spears, and bullets. In every part, to the number perhaps more than 20 different wounds, he had, besides, a face naturally ferocious and ugly, and now rendered still more so by several scars there, and by the loss of one eye." When asked by one of the English gentlemen present, with a tone of encouragement and familiarity, whether he could not still dispatch an enemy with his boneless arm, he drew a crooked dagger or yambia, from the girdle around his shirt and placing his left hand, which was sound, to support the elbow of the right, which was the one that was wounded. He grasped the dagger firmly in his clenched fist and drew it backward and forward, twirling it and saying that he desired nothing better than to have the cutting of as many throats as he could effectually open with his lame hand, instead of being shocked at the utterance of such a brutal wish, and such a savage triumph at still possessing the power to murder unoffending victims. I know not how to describe my feelings of shame and sorrow when I ventured to express my dissent from the general feeling of admiration for such a man. In any case, Rahma continuously attacked Bahrain over the next years, capturing 7 Bahraini vessels and killing 20 men in 1821 to 1822. The constant warring wore his men down, and attrition and desertions took its toll on the crew, prompting him to seek help from the British in Iran. The British refused to aid Rahma, but Rahma continued to wage his war against Bahrain, being severely outnumbered. It was in 1826 Rahma launched a raid on Bahrain once again. Upon discovering stolen goods, his nephew, Sheikh Ahmed bin Salman al-Khalifa, a part of the rulers of Bahrain, decided to recover the goods and met his uncle on sea. After his nephew boarded his ships, fierce melee fighting occurred, and, seeing his men fall one by one, Rahma decided to retreat into the inner galley of his ship with his 8-year-old son. Holding his son, he lit gunpowder kegs with charcoal from his hookah, causing the ship to blow up in a massive explosion, killing all of Rahma's crew, including himself and the crew boarding his ship. The only thing that could be made out was the 2 ships sinking beneath the waves. In the end, Rahma was a really infamous pirate during this time in the Persian Gulf, exercising his power via piracy, even though he was severely outnumbered, enacting his revenge to retake what was rightfully his tribes, that is, Bahrain. He is quite an interesting figure, having suffered a brutal death in a last-ditch attempt to seek vengeance on the Bahraini rulers. José Gaspar. José Gaspar, also known by his nickname Gasparilla, was a legendary Spanish pirate who allegedly terrorized shipping in the Gulf of Mexico from southwest Florida. I say allegedly because there is no evidence he ever existed, no contemporary mentions of his life or exploits, no newspaper articles or physical artifacts. There are some variations to his story though, but most agree he was born near the ocean in Spain, sometime in 1756. Here he developed an attraction to adventure and an affinity to the sea as a whole. His early life is a bit of a mystery. It is agreed he joined the Spanish Navy before turning to piracy. The versions differ, however, to what extent he was involved in the Navy. One story tells of him being a Spanish nobleman who was an advisor to the Spanish king, stealing the crown jewels with his connections to royalty. Another story purports Gaspar was born a poor man who kidnapped a young girl for ransom. Captured and given a choice between prison and joining the Spanish Navy, he went to sea and served for several years, before mutineering with his crew because of a tyrannical captain or because of losing against the British in naval combat. Another story says the captain proved to be a coward in battle, and Gaspar was disillusioned with him, leading him to take power by force. You get the point though. It is really uncertain what he actually did. I found sources alleging he was a skilled sword fighter, well educated and experienced. He was reportedly, quote, strikingly handsome, with faultless attire, and had bushy eyebrows, as well as a hawk-like face. Whatever his origins might have been, legend says he turned to piracy on his flagship, the Floridablanca, and established an outpost with his pirate crew off the coast of Spanish Florida. The many barrier islands proved to be a great hiding spot from the Spanish authorities. Gasparilla named one of the islands after himself, Gasparilla Island, one after the girlfriend of his first lieutenant, Sunny Bell, another one he named Captiva Island, after the fact prisoners of plundered vessels were either put to death or ransomed here, and lastly an island named after one of Gasparilla's mistresses, Usepa. Supposedly, Usepa was a captured woman and refused Gasparilla's advances toward her, so Gasparilla killed her in a rage, regretted the deed, and buried Usepa on the unnamed island, naming it after her. Some attribute Usepa to the lady Josefa de Mayorga, daughter of the Viceroy of Spain between 1779 and 1782, and allege Josefa evolved to Usepa over the decades. Whether this is true, though, is a mystery, and it might just be a coincidence. In any case, the true number of ships Gasparilla raided is unknown, though it was enough for the American authorities to intervene and put an end to his piratical activities in late 1821, just after the Spanish transferred control over Spanish Spanish Florida to the US. As the story goes, on December 12th, 1821, he gathered his crew together and called an end to their piracy, intending to retire and split the booty among the crew members. Just when they were about to divvy up the treasures, a lookout spotted an English merchant ship nearby. Being greedy men, they could not resist taking a final ship captive and hurriedly boarded the Floridablanca to pursue their prey. Though when they neared the ship and fired a warning shot, the merchant ship's flag was lowered and an American flag was hoisted instead, revealing the ship was actually a US warship, the USS Enterprise. A fierce battle ensued and the Floridablanca was hit multiple times, slowly sinking into the sea, with most of his crew laying dead and running out of gunpowder. Instead of surrendering, Gasparilla wrapped a heavy anchor chain around himself and jumped into the sea. As he jumped, he held his sword high over his head and allegedly shouted, quote, "Gasparilla dies by his own hand, not the enemy's." He subsequently died and sunk beneath the waves, dying at the old age of 65. Though most of Gasparilla's crew was killed in action, legends say there were 12 survivors, 11 men and 1 cabin boy, named Juan Gomez. The 11 men were tried and executed in New Orleans, while Juan Gomez lived to tell the tale of Gasparilla. It is said Gomez liked to tell the tale and embellish some of his experiences, leading to the consequent uncertainty of Gasparilla's actions. So, was Gasparilla a real pirate or just a myth? In the end, we truly don't know. However, it is likely he was not real, considering he lived well after the end of the golden age of piracy, which at the latest estimate ended in the 1730s, so almost a century removed. Piracy was pretty rare and scattered in the area. Every major pirate operating in the Spanish Main was killed by this time, such as William Kidd, Blackbeard or Stede Bonnet, along with others. Additionally, storytellers write that the pirate crew had amassed a treasure worth around $30 million in 1821. Comparatively, Spain sold Florida to the US for $5 million that year. It is highly unlikely they ever captured this much wealth, considering the powers in the region actively tried to hunt and exterminate any pirate activity in the area. To put the final nail in the coffin, the USS Enterprise, the warship that allegedly sunk the Floridablanca, never documented encountering pirates during late 1821, and in fact was not even near Florida at the time, instead stationed near Cuba. You get the idea. Gaspar was likely not a real pirate and simply a literary invention by later authors, though some today still attribute Gaspar's story to that of Black Caesar or other pirates in the area. But who knows, maybe someday we'll find some physical evidence of Gaspar's activity on the ocean floor in the Gulf of Mexico. Kingdom of Tungning. The Kingdom of Tungning, also known as Taiwan, was a dynastic kingdom established in southwestern Taiwan by Ming loyalist and former pirate Zheng Chenggong, better known as the Dutch name Koxinga, being the first ethnic Han state in Taiwanese history. The Ming dynasty at this time was a shell of its former self, as the Qing dynasty in northern China took over most of the important centers. The Ming dynasty still ruled over large territories in southern China, but barely had any power, and the Qing would soon take over these areas as well. As an attempt to sort of make a last stand in hopes of reconquering lost territories and reinstating the Ming dynasty, Zheng took control in 1661. Taiwan at this time was mostly controlled by the Dutch East India Company, especially in southwestern Taiwan, where the Dutch had a large fort. Zheng's forces surrounded the fort and besieged it for around a year before the Dutch ultimately surrendered and gave up Taiwan, leading to Zheng consolidating his new domain, though he died a few months after in 1662. In his short rule, Zheng promoted intense Sinicization, which is a fancy term meaning he wanted to turn the indigenous population Chinese, more specifically under Ming rule. After Zheng's death, his son, Zheng Ying, took over. I'll just call him Ying to avoid confusion. This change of power was met with dissent in the kingdom, leading to many soldiers, sailors, and officers, as well as civilians defecting to the Qing regime. In fact, it is estimated around 100,000 soldiers and civilians, as well as 900 ships defected. Seeing this as a major problem, Ying massively promoted migration so as to avoid a total population decline, which worked for the time being. Ying also enacted agricultural and land reforms, such as using water storages for dry periods, cultivation of sugarcane as a cash crop to trade with the Europeans, and more. These reforms made the Tungning kingdom pretty self-sufficient and independent from China. In 1673, a massive revolt rose up in mainland China, and Ying took advantage of this instability. Ying's massive fleet raided coastal areas in Zhejiang and Fujian, areas in southern China, and the most important trading center in the region of Xiamen. A year later, Ying conquered the port city of Quanshu and Zhongzhou. At their heights, they controlled large swaths of coastal areas and the inner Yangtze River, as seen on this map. However, the tide started to turn against Ying, and Qing forces recaptured Quanshu in March 1677 and Zhengzhou in April. Ying's naval forces tried to blockade and retake Quanshu back, but were repelled in August 1678, before being driven entirely out of mainland China in April 1680. During this time though, Taiwan was a safe haven for pirates in the South China Sea, and for the Qing and the Dutch, this proved to be a thorn in their side, as merchant vessels could not enter the area around Taiwan safely without fear of falling victim to piracy. After Zheng Ying's death in 1681, his son Zheng Keishuang took over. And yes, if you couldn't tell already, everyone is called Zheng, which is why sometimes people refer to the Tungning kingdom as the Zheng dynasty. Even though the dynasty lost control over the Chinese mainland, maritime incursions into coastal towns of mainland China were launched regularly, critically disrupting trade in the area. This, of course, angered the Qing, and to an extent the Dutch, who were intending to trade with the Japanese and Chinese from the colony in Indonesia. Qing Admiral Shi Lang understood this and considered Taiwan to be a safe haven for Chinese pirates, which was true. The government did not stop piratical activities, and in fact likely condoned it, as to extend their power from their comparatively small base. Shi Lang was actually an admiral in Zheng's navy decades earlier, but defected to the Qing, now wanting to launch a naval invasion against Taiwan, so as to secure the southeastern flank. A fleet of 300 warships and 21,000 troops departed from mainland China in June 1683 and targeted a series of strategically important islands close to Taiwan, known as the Penghu Islands, where a Tungning fleet of around 200 ships were waiting. The battle, unfolding from the 10th of July to the 16th, 1683, was very fiercely fought between the two powers, though better tactics and firepower made the Tungning admiral's flagship run out of ammunition, thus forcing it to surrender. This surrender shattered Tungning morale, urging the ruler Keishuang to surrender formally. This was signed on October 5th, 1683, without any interference or executions, ending the 22 years of Tungning rule. For the time, this was pretty peacefully done. The higher-ups were given amnesty by the Qing government, the army demobilized, and ethnically Han settlers integrated. Some smaller incursions and pockets of resistance were wiped out over the years, and the island fully annexed at last. Now, I don't know why this is on the iceberg at all. From looking at the sources, it is difficult to judge whether the kingdom was actually actively encouraging piratical activities. I personally would not say so. However, I do believe some piracy occurred, though it is hard to tell this apart from normal naval warfare, as the Tungning kingdom was definitely at war with the Qing, and technically with the Dutch as well. At the very least, the government condoned piracy, since it helped in their war effort. But was it an all-out pirate state? Probably not. Perhaps you disagree though. Let me know what you think of this entry down below. Albert Hicks. Albert W. Hicks, also known as Elias W. Hicks, William Johnson, John Hicks, or just simply Pirate Hicks, was at least a triple murderer and widely considered to be the last pirate to be executed in the US. Born around 1820 to a farmer and one of 7 children in Foster, Rhode Island, he grew up on a farm and never attended school. During his childhood, he was a headstrong man and a fighter amongst his peers. However, at age 15, he ran away from the farm and started a new life of crime in Norwich, Connecticut. He envisioned a life where he would get rich quickly through piracy and theft, which he could then use to fuel his passions and desires. Hicks would be arrested for theft multiple times throughout his teenage years, even being in jail in solitary confinement for a year. Here he was abused by his inmates and went a little insane. Thus he swore vengeance against the whole human race. Hicks went on many adventures over the years, A few too many to mention here, but I will cover two of the most well-known ones. The first one, Hicks was on the large 697-ton large ship named Charles Mallory. Here, Hicks and his accomplice, Tom Stone, boarded the Charles Mallory, which was built in Mystic, Connecticut. From there, it would travel to Liverpool, England, before heading to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. In Hicks' own words, quote, "On the passage, believing that there was a considerable amount of money on board, I used all my endeavors to stir the crew up to mutiny, intending, if possible, to kill the officers and make myself master of the lion's share of the plunder, but I could not succeed in bringing matters to a crisis. Although the whole voyage was a series of rows and fights, in which I was generally the principal, when we arrived in Rio, all hands left the ship, but myself and Tom Stone, who were forced to remain, as we were both sick, and as soon as we began to recover, they put us both in irons." Stone and Hicks both broke their chains after the crew went ashore, quietly fleeing into Rio de Janeiro, and soon after boarding on the ship Admiral Grandfoot, heading for New Orleans. While this mutiny failed, and Hicks barely escaped, it proved to be a great learning experience for Hicks, as we will see in the following adventure I'll cover. Hicks was hired on as a deckhand on the oyster sloop Edwin A. Johnson, of which the captain George H. Burr and the Watts brothers, Oliver and Smith Watts, were in charge. Including Hicks, they were the only 4 men on the boat, heading for Virginia to buy oysters to then ship back to New York City. At night, when the sloop neared New York City, Captain Burr and Oliver went to their quarters, while Smith and Hicks had their night duty. Hicks alerted Smith that he saw something in the distance. Not seeing anything, Hicks tried to get Smith's attention again, this time taking a sea axe and striking him to the head from behind, knocking him unconscious. Oliver woke up from this commotion, checking up on what's going on outside. He opened the hatch and peeked outside, only to be struck immediately by Hicks, decapitating him instantly. Hicks now went into Burr's cabin, who was a tall, strong man. The struggle took a while, where Burr almost strangled Hicks, but Hicks took his axe again and slashed Burr's face, killing him as well. As Hicks went outside, he saw Smith's body still moving. A horrifying scene then happened. Hicks took Smith's body and tried to throw it overboard, only for Smith to hold onto the ledge. With one swift strike, Hicks cut off Smith's fingers and Smith's body fell into the ocean. Finally, Hicks threw Oliver's and Burr's bodies along with the axe overboard. Hicks intended to sink the boat and all the evidence along it by scuttling. He took the money, around $230 back then, probably something around $9,000 today, took a small lifeboat, and abandoned the Johnson. He rode into the night and tried to go undercover in Manhattan. Unluckily for him, the Johnson was only found a day later by the Coast Guard, and Smith's severed fingers still on board. They traced the evidence back, which led them to an apartment in Manhattan. The story of the murders took New York City by storm and spread all over local newspapers, and Hicks caught wind of this as well and quickly fled the city, fleeing to a boarding home outside Providence, Rhode Island. Authorities quickly followed and took captive of him in his bed in the middle of the night. Hicks surrendered without a fight, while the detectives took Captain Burr's watch, several bags of money, and a daguerreotype, the predecessor to the modern-day camera, and other evidence belonging to the crew. On May 14, 1860, he was put on trial. The trial was very swift and decisive, as the evidence the detectives gathered was too damning for Hicks to be proven innocent. In fact, the trial only took 7 minutes. That's how clear this case was. The judge sentenced him to hanging, which took place a month later, on July 13, 1860, on Bedloe's Island, now known as Liberty Island, the place where the Statue of Liberty is now standing. During this 1-month span, he desperately tried to cover for his wife and newborn child, and confessed to all his crimes in a book, which was published on the day of his execution, containing chilling accounts of his many exploits across the seas. Quote, "I can't stand it no longer. I had hoped that I should carry the secrets of my life with me to my grave. I never thought that I should sit here in my cell crying like a baby over the remembrance of the past, or that my heart would flinch at meeting any fate in store for me. I have long felt as though I were the devil's own, and that though he had served me so many years, I must at last be his. Yet I imagined he would not claim me yet, but allow me to do his work for a time longer. He had stood by me all my life, on ship and on shore, amid the howling storms of the ocean, where every moment the waves threatened to engulf me. He has snatched me from their deadly embrace on the battlefield in many a hand-to-hand fight. He has seemed to stand by my side, protecting me from danger, and when I have been in the hands of my enemies, an escape has appeared impossible, he has, until now, invariably opened the way for my release. But at last he has deserted me. In vain I call upon him, he will not answer me, and I dare not call on God. For what pity should he show a guilty wretch like me? Quite a chilling account, right? He denies it was him who for so long terrorized American waters, blaming it on the devil taking advantage of him. On his execution day, crowds numbering around 10,000 people gathered on the island, watching as Hicks was led to the gallows. In his final moments, Hicks was strangely calm, accepting his fate. He was neatly and sharply dressed, before saying to the executioner, "Hang me quick, make haste," not delivering any speech. His execution pretty much marked the end of piracy on American waters, a final nail in the coffin, nearly 1.5 centuries after the golden age of piracy. Liang Daoming. Liang Daoming was a Cantonese absconder from Guangdong province who was also a local king of Palembang, an important port city in Sumatra. Ming records report he commanded thousands of followers and a sizable military force from Fujian and Guangdong, who then settled in Palembang. The Ming dynasty acknowledged his rule over the area and was protected by Zheng He's armada. Zheng He was an important admiral at this time, even being considered the most successful admiral in all of Chinese history. That's it. That's all I could really find out about this man. I spent a long time searching for any sources, but there were basically no sources reporting on him. The Ming court mentions him very briefly, that's all we have. Since this is on the iceberg, and I found a forum post mentioning him in passage, I believe he might have been active as a pirate, considering he was an absconder, someone who flees from authorities to avoid legal trouble. One can infer he might have been a criminal or pirate before leaving for Palembang, since we know nothing about his early life or how he learned how to sail the seas. This would neatly explain why he was successful in establishing a Chinese foothold in Indonesia. Perhaps he was a local celebrity in Guangdong, amassing thousands of former sailors, merchants, or migrants seeking profit or protection. Though Ming's sources do not comment on any piracy whatsoever, he could very likely have been a local leader of a community of outcasts or settlers hoping to start a new life elsewhere than a pirate per se. But in the end, we do not know. We may never know, as his fate is unknown. I'm genuinely curious how the creator of this iceberg even found out about this man, and if you have any information whatsoever about Liang Daoming, feel free to share it down below. I've tried my best here. Zulmiro. Zulmiro was a pirate long thought to be an urban legend originating from the Brazilian city of Curitiba. I say long thought because in 2018, a self-taught archaeologist, Marcos Juliano Offenbach, proved his existence. Originally, no one knew who he was. Legends suggested he was a British man who lived in Curitiba sometime in the 19th century and hid a trunk full of jewels and gold under an old cemetery, leading countless residents of Curitiba and outsiders to search for the treasure, and that's how the legend spread initially. However, the aforementioned archaeologist discovered Zulmiro was in fact a real person. Born in 1798 in the then British city of Cork, Francis Hodder, his real name, was born into a rich and privileged family. In 1811, he went to Eton College in England and joined the Royal Navy after he graduated, though I do have to mention, this man was pretty much erased from any records. Neither Eton College nor the Royal Navy mentions him, meaning the British deliberately suppressed his existence, or the Hodder family managed to erase the records of him. And also, little side note, I found a forum thread discussing the pirate, and the archaeologist who initially found out Zulmiro had historical links actually regularly posted and discussed information about him, which I found pretty neat. In any case, his place in high society and life of privilege quickly changed as he got into a heated disagreement with an officer in Bermuda, killing him. To escape the authorities and death penalty, he deserted, adopting the name Zulmiro, and joined a group of pirates. As a pirate, Zulmiro participated alongside two other known pirates, the Spanish José Sancho and Russian Zaralho in the theft of the Lima Cathedral in Peru in 1821. This is the same treasure I mentioned in whatever tier that was earlier, but as you may remember, the leading story is that a British pirate went to Cocos Island and buried it there. In this version, it was the crew of Zulmiro who attacked the Spanish ship on Trinidad Island, an island off the coast of Brazil in the southern Atlantic. He also participated in other piratical raids, though there are no sources of specific raids. In 1831, he was captured by Keppel, commander of an English warship. The two were old friends, having met in the Royal Navy, so the commander spared him on the condition he would leave his life of crime and move to the interior of Brazil. Zulmiro complied and moved to the then small city of Curitiba, only having around 3,000 inhabitants, and lived the rest of his life there. Zulmiro adopted the name João Francisco Inglês, leaving behind his pirate ways and living a normal life. English immigrant Edward Stammers Young met Zulmiro in 1880 and wrote letters of what he was told. Quote, Zulmiro told about terrible scenes at sea, battles, approaching ships, imprisoning merchant ships, deaths, shipwrecks, murdering entire crews, a real bloody tragedy scenario in which he, the lonely man, had participated during his youth. He told terrible stories in which he was one of the protagonists and the most feared and brave in the group of people who threw themselves into a life of piracy. Zulmiro also wrote of the treasure he had hid on the aforementioned island of Trinidad. Quote, the treasure is hidden on an island named Trinidad, 648 miles off the coast of Brazil, in two different locations. The first one has gold in powder and bars, currencies from different countries, as well as valuable gems. This deposit's worth may be estimated at £5 million. The other deposit, despite being larger, is not as valuable, consisting of works of art in gold and silver, as well as 63 solid 6x2 by 4-inch silver bars, all of which were the spoils of many years of piracy. He goes on to give detailed descriptions of the deposits, one being close to a waterfall and another one being hid on the southern bay. Quote, the 19 parcels include 11 barrels filled with coins, 2 large open trunks containing 81 small gold bars, a clock case filled with jewels, 12 tied and sealed lead bags containing gems, a tea box filled with unassembled jewels, and 2 leaf boxes filled with powder gold. The parcels, all oversized, are hidden in this barn, stacked in a pile inside barrels and drums, boxes and trunks, which fill the entire room. Its artistic value is immeasurable, and its intrinsic value is approximately £3 million. The round can holds documents of deposits that are only valuable for their legitimate owners, and they currently may only be useful to the Bank of England. The treasure cannot be found without this description. Yet till this day, the treasure has not been found, as the terrain of the island changed drastically over the decades, and it is unlikely it ever will be, but perhaps someday, some explorer will excavate one of the biggest treasures in human history. And the story of Zulmiro is not done yet. We still have many holes in his story that need to be filled, and especially recently, research has been going well into deciphering Zulmiro's story. Alas, Zulmiro died in 1889 at the old age of 91, having lived more than 50 years in Curitiba, with no one knowing of his past, spurring on countless legends and myths. And even today, the pirate has had a profound impact on Curitiba, having a playground named after him and plaques of his story made. In my opinion, Zulmiro was an amazing story to read about, seeing how a legend actually had historicity, seeing how a story was expanded upon and holes gradually filled, fleshing out the adventure of an Englishman who potentially captured one of the largest treasures ever.